The May State Board work session will now come to order. Denise, please call the roll.
Rachel Wise.
Present.
Lily Larson.
Present.
Glen Flint.
Here.
John Witzel.
Here.
Molly O'Halloran.
Present.
Patricia Tim.
Yes.
Maureen Nichols.
Yes.
Patrick McPherson.
Yes.
And Commissioner Bloomstadt.
Present.
All present.
Information regarding the Open Meetings Act is posted on the east wall of this room on the south side of the door. Live web streaming will be available through the State Board of Education website, www.education.ne.gov/stateboard. Board members, please remember to engage your microphones before speaking and turn them off when you're finished. And please turn off personal cell phones. Thank you. We'll move on to item 2, board reports, dates, and discussion items. We'll start with any meeting participation. And does anyone want to share where they've been the past month?
District 4, we've been very, very busy this past month in regards to we attended the FFA Legislative Breakfast and Awards Ceremony at the beginning of last month. Also, the Commissioner and I were honored to be invited to the Doane College Graduate Panel discussion, discussing, if you will, rules and policies in our education field today. Had a short meeting with Dr. Hawkins at Bellevue University. Again, she was very, very pleased with the NDE visit and looks forward to progress in regards to with the teaching. Also was invited to the D2 Center for a visit and orientation of their, if you will, programs for their students yearning to get a high school diploma. Was invited to the Boys and Girls Club in South Omaha for a presentation. And you and I and Dr. Friesen attended the Nebraska Education Technology Association conference at the same time with the Skills USA presentation. Dr. Friesen and I attended the memorial and funeral for OPS Principal Crystal Simpson. We were, if you will, very sad of her passing, but honored to attend and, if you will, honor her memory and her work with OPS. Attended the Heartland Entrepreneurial Conference with Greg Christensen from NDE. It was at MCC, and joined with other area superintendents for Avenue Scholars Banquet, if you will, working with the young people and so forth. But probably the most important of all function I was able to attend this past month.
Oh, short tell.
I was able to attend the graduation for 8 of our GED students at Metro Community College. It was quite a ceremony. The parents, relatives, there wasn't a group that was happier, that's for sure.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Anyone else want to, Molly?
I actually stayed in North Platte this month. I was a guest speaker at Washington Elementary, and I bring good tidings from Ron Hansen, our new superintendent. He is so excited about the revision process and career tech education. So Washington Elementary had a career days that was highlighting women, and I was kind of the keynote, and I thought, I'm the only one that wasn't making any money. My career is not geared toward that kind of outcome, but it was really cool because of your work on the State Board of Ed. We had little grade school kids talking about career futures. They asked me about coding, and they were really interested. In North Platte, we have a Mid-Plains Community College, and we have a new science center, so there was a large entrance in healthcare. And it was so cute to see these little kids already thinking about their own little personalized path and the pros and cons. And I guess when I looked at their faces, I thought Nebraska's in good stead. If you can get to your school buildings or districts, it's so fun to see how our policies are playing out and making a difference. So I wanted to thank you for that. And then also I went to Jefferson Elementary and talked to 60 kindergartners about water safety and health. Since I'm on safety and security, they invited me, and I thought, sure, we'll talk. And I don't know if you recall, but last year we had some graduates that were in a car, and we had a flood out, and they drowned in the South Platte River. So in North Platte, we're really big about water safety. So thank you.
Thanks, Molly. Anyone else? Glenn?
I must have just missed you guys. I was also at the NEDA conference and the skills competition. That was very interesting. To see they were building brick walls and it was, yeah, they were doing everything in there. And so I'd never seen the CenturyLink Center with so many diverse activities going on under the same roof. So enjoyed that.
And I also stopped by. I didn't have a chance to spend a lot of time at the NADA conference, but I did stop by and I listened in a couple sessions. Also attended the Rule 4 section, or session on April the 12th, and that was first time I've attended a rule setting session, and was instructive, I guess, is the way I'd put it. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Maureen?
Well, after our last board meeting, I attended with several of the board members the awards presentation for the FFA conference being held, their annual meeting, where we handed out awards to the administrators who were very supportive of FFA in their schools. And I was very pleased because I had 3 of my schools in District 6 represented, so I was really pretty proud of that fact. The other was I attended just the first day of the data conference, and I am just overwhelmed with the number of school administrators and teachers and staff that attend that. It's a great time for me as a board member to connect with administrators and teachers from all over the state, not just in my district. But it's always great when I can talk to those in my own district. But I attended a session, AQuest 101, done by Sue Anderson, who it was just really, the reason I attended it was mainly because I wanted to hear what the folks in the room were questioning. And Sue, first of all, just did an awesome presentation, as we would expect. But the questions and the conversation that took place in the room was just excellent. The other one I went to and did some learning with, it's always good to get that student back in me, was I attended Dr. Corey Epler's session on contextualized teaching and learning, and I was that student back in that classroom again, just listening to what really is contextualized learning. And I just took a few notes that I put down, and it's really it's taking the best practices and putting it into going from relevant teaching and understanding to making it authentic and how it really does apply. Why are we taking this class? Well, you're going to find out. And so you move from teaching relevant information to making it authentic. And it was just it was a captivating session to sit in. And then the last session I attended, besides having lunch, and that was a conversation with the commissioner. And Rachel was there, and we sat in on, and again, it was, I wanted to hear the questions and concerns that the administrators had with the commissioner, and he just did an excellent job, and I think answered questions quite well. Yesterday, I had the outstanding opportunity I was invited to Hawthorne Elementary in Hastings, Nebraska. And they received, they called it the Hawthorne Elementary Celebration of Excellence. They received a national honor called the National Model Professional Learning Community School at Work by All Things PLC. And this national distinction has only been awarded to one other school in Nebraska outside of the Hastings Public Schools. But it was really an exciting event to have 365 elementary students from kindergarten to 5th grade walk into the gymnasium and sit down. And I was sitting next to Senator Les Seiler, who had given the proclamation from the governor's office, and the president of Hastings College. And as the children were walking in, the president from Hastings College, he nudged me and he goes, "Boy, these kids are really cool, aren't they?" And I looked at him and I said, being that former elementary teacher, I said, "Yes, they are, and they are our future." And he goes, "They are." And what I especially loved, and I took several pictures, was right next to me was a young man in a wheelchair, but he had his therapy dog with him. And that therapy dog, and I've gotten to know a lot of therapy dogs in my district, in the schools, but this, I watched as the children left the gymnasium, and the therapy dog got up, he knew the commands of time to leave, and he turned around and he had a belt strapped to the wheelchair, and he pulled the little boy in his wheelchair to the outside area. It was education at its finest. And I posted on Facebook that Hawthorne Elementary is a shining example of everything that's going on across our great state with students, learning, and teachers.
Pat?
We talk a lot about community involvement and reaching out to our community, and I had the opportunity, I'm on the foster grandparent board in Beatrice, and they had the recognition luncheon for their volunteers at their stations, and our foster grandparent program is managed by Community Action in our area. And I don't know about your other districts, but we really do have a lot of people involved, not only in the school districts, but in BSDC and Mosaic, in helping with those young people too. And it truly amazed me, the dedication that these foster grandparents put in, because of course it's income based, and they put in so many hours, and it's, you know, volunteer as to how many hours. But we had 2 foster grandparents that were honored for over 2,000 hours, and go above and beyond their school that they work with. They go to the Y in the summer, or they go someplace else, you know, in the community to help. And they did they always have a slideshow with the foster grandparents and the kids. And you know, I mean, it's so much fun to watch, to see what those foster grandparents let those kids do to them, because this, particularly the little ones. So it's an excellent program, and it's really a great way to get people involved in the schools.
Lily?
You might have mentioned it, John and Patrick, that it was on April the 12th, which was the Catholic Conference hearing, and I did attend coming here to the office. And I've had very kind, appreciative notes that have come to me from the Catholic Conference, very positive reaction to working out the textbook issue. Then it was just yesterday that I attended a luncheon which is held at the university on an annual basis, where students participate in investments, Wall Street project. And so the students who were just spectacular in their investments, because they're given, I think it's in the neighborhood of pretend money of $100,000, which they then in turn invest in stocks that they select. And so the one school that just won straight down the line was from Kimball. And so the whole 5th grade class at Kimball was there, and I've decided I may need them as my stockbroker. They just did a phenomenal job, and that is an annual event, so maybe one of you will be able to attend that next year, because they are practicing the development of the math skills, the social skills, everything imaginable, and they don't realize it. They're doing it, the percentages and the like. And it is a fantastic hands-on project promoted by the University of Nebraska, primarily through the business school. And they know those are their potential students someday.
Thanks, Lily. And I won't repeat where many of us were, and I enjoyed definitely also the NETA and the skills. The AQuest, I would just like to say too, thanks to all the Nebraska Department of Education staff, because that really is very much a Nebraska Department of Education conference, and the work that they do and lead in that conference. It really was an outstanding conference, and hopefully it may work for you in your calendars next year, because it was very, very informative conference. Just a couple of things I want to touch base on related to NASB. I was in Kansas City for a pre-planning session for NASB annual conference, which is October 22nd, 23rd, I believe. And we'll talk about it a little bit more going forward, but I do think that emphasis for that annual conference will be around continuing emphasis around ESSA and what we know about ESSA, as well as accountability being probably a strong theme of that conference. And it is pretty close to home, so to speak, for our annual conference with NASB. Also, I know you received the materials from NASB regarding awards and recognition, so if you take a look at that, I know in the past we've submitted some names. Whether we do this year or down the road, do keep that in mind when that crosses your email, as well as we'll learn more tomorrow a little bit of the resources that NASB's really putting together for us to help us continue to navigate where we're going with ESSA and the direction that we go. So some of their materials and resources that are coming out are really beneficial. So just wanted you to keep that in mind. I had one other opportunity I just want to touch base, and it's Cumming County. Their economic development does a program called Bright Lights with students with the 4 school districts in that particular county, and just do a really great activity with young people on developing some entrepreneurial skills. And kids are challenged with coming up with a business plan and an idea to continue for growth in Cumming County, which is around West Point. And it just really was great to hear those student presentations. And, it does, I think, make us feel very excited about the future when you listen to young people and the creativity and innovation that young people have. And so it's very, very rewarding from that perspective. So continuing on, you do have meeting requests in your materials for this meeting, so make sure you review those. We'll talk about those tomorrow. If there are any meetings coming up that you haven't signed up for, please do so. We also will be discussing that as we move forward. And also you have the monthly board travel expense in your e-materials as well. If there aren't any questions on upcoming meetings or those expenses, then we'll move on to the Commissioner's report and agenda overview. Commissioner?
All right, thank you once again for all your dedication. I know we threw a lot of material at you in a very short period of time, and I appreciate you taking all of that on. Kind of first thing, just remember on consent agenda, if you have anything, just to fill out that pink form and give it to Margaret, I guess. Thinking of Margaret, as many of you know, Margaret's going to be retiring this summer. There is a new person running around, sitting in a temporary office location right now. Sarah, I'm not going to get the right name. Hulack. That has just started with us in legal counsel office as well. And so if you happen to see Sarah, that's who she is. And I barely had any time to chat with her yet. So we really welcome her to the department as well. And I was just thinking, Ryan, I see over there, would you mind introducing Gaspari? And sure. It might help just so it's heard better, so. Yeah, well, he's only, he showed up for our committee meeting, so that makes it part of it.
So I'm Ryan Four, and I work on the teaching and learning team, and was approached by a colleague at Penn State to host Gaspari as a professional affiliate. Gaspari Cordova comes to us from Belize. He's planning to work in the Ministry of Education there in a role similar to a career field specialist, like on the career education side. He is part of the Hubert Humphrey Fellowship Program, which is a program through the U.S. Department of State that brings visiting scholars to the United States in different areas. Gaspari's area, of course, is education. So he spent the last year at Penn State in graduate studies related to curriculum development. And so then he'll spend the next 6 weeks with us here at the Department of Education, learning about our standards and resources that we provide to local schools and educators.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank you
thank
for
you.
being here.
Welcome.
We're all going to visit Belize when he's there. And then I want to point out one more. In fact, welcome all the guests, but Greg Barnes, I believe, probably here representing Stance, I would suspect today. But I have to. Greg is superintendent at Seward, one of my former bosses, by the way. So Greg was a president of NERCSA at the time I was there. So thanks to everyone for being here today. So. The dynamic, the next thing, we've already talked a little bit about the Rule 4 hearing, and we have the regular rules update on my report here as well. But I'll hit on Rule 4, I guess, first. With Rule 4, we had the hearing on April 12th, I think is the right day.
Yes.
And, at that point in time, of course, we did that particular hearing based on the petition from the Nebraska Catholic Conference. They actually appeared and testified and said, hey, look, this might not be exactly the right language for us, but going through that hearing process, we identified some areas of which we can start to do that work. We did have a follow-up, and Lily was able to be here in the Lincoln site when we did that with a follow-up with Sherry Rickard and Greg Schleppenbach, both from the Catholic Conference and a couple other folks that we engaged in a conversation. At that point, we talked about the importance of coming up with some language that really will hopefully work for us in the future. We bounced some ideas around so far. Sherry may come tomorrow, I don't know for sure, but we've bounced some ideas around so far and are coming up with some language I think will be able to move us forward, be able to move us ultimately forward. If you remember, we also had legislation that they provided some intent language that we would have to go back to the Education Committee with any potential changes in statute if we have to go ahead and do that. We're trying to use this process to inform us of what that might be. If we do come across something that wouldn't currently fit the statutory requirements, if we would have to expand statutory requirements or otherwise clarify, we also want out of this process ultimately to be able to make that type of recommendation, but to do that in concert with those that have some interest in that. I will tell you that as we continue that process, we will have to have another hearing once we get to other language, so we'll go ahead and do that. I think you'll hear from Sherry a little bit that, and you certainly did hear it at the hearing itself, they didn't anticipate this would be the language that would ultimately pass. So that's why I don't bring it to you for your vote up or down. My understanding is that we don't have to go through that process. We can simply organize additional language, and I can do that based on how policy works to be able to introduce that language for a potential another hearing as we work on that. We will gather up another kind of group of stakeholders to review some other proposed language before we take it to hearing. So that's just a quick update on where we're at. I would anticipate we try to get some of that done, so maybe as soon as August or at least maybe September, we would actually have something for your consideration at that point. So I'm going to see if I have any other rule update. Maybe there's questions on that.
Any
one.
questions or comments on the Rule 4? Okay.
I do have a report in front of you also just attached to that. We have Rule 25 that is about the Excellence in Teaching Act. That one's in front of you. Obviously, we had the celebration around Rule 81 passing with fairly record speed to actually move by the governor and the Attorney General's office very quickly, but as John already highlighted, that was very important for folks in kind of waiting for that change to take place.
Thank you, Commissioner. At the graduation, they were very, very emphatic about thanking NDE and the board and the governor for expediting the signature and getting the rule changed, equal to their celebration on Sunday. Thank you.
So with that's kind of the end on the rule-making processes. Donlin is here. If Donlin's got a couple things to report. Obviously, again, thank you for your efforts on the strategic planning elements of our work, and you know, kind of as their big overview. We'll have quite a few action items yet to go through here today. I just might mention, and we'll try to have Mark Schultz try to condense those comments down together, and I'll help remember to do that. So.
Good. Thank you. I would just like to echo that. Thank you, all of you, for not only your participation today, but all of the pre-reading I've been sending you between this morning and then tomorrow for ESSA. I know you've had a lot of extra homework this month, so thank you. I did just want to briefly report out our NASB stipend standards alignment group met yesterday. And in light of our strategic planning and then the ESSA work, we kind of decided we'd wait until August to meet again because we think all of that will dovetail nicely together. So we kind of want to spend a little bit of time seeing what those pieces are going to look like, and then we'll get back to work. This is a 2-year grant, and so we're barely into the first year, so we have a lot of time, and we'll be able to use those dollars, I think, to help with the implementation, or at least get some opportunity for input on our strategic plan and ESSA work through the grant. So thank you.
Thank you. Anything else, Commissioner, then?
That's all for me.
All right, so we'll move on to item 4, discussion of action items. And as the Commissioner mentioned, we're going to sometimes group some items together. I think we're probably grouping 1 and 2 together, and it looks like Rich Cott, AKA Corey Epler,
I want to note that
here
Rich is
for
no longer
items.
my boss, yet assigning me work.
Okay.
So,
As it should be,
as it
I
should
guess.
be and
So
always will be.
I'm assuming you're covering items 1 and 2.
yes, I'm covering both. Rich is actually ill today, so I'll be able to speak to items 4.1 and 4.2. If you have specific questions, Rich will be the lead contact. But item 4.1 is a contract with the Associated General Contractors, Nebraska Building Chapter. Within Federal Perkins Fund, there is a requirement to spend funds for gender non-traditional careers. And in light of the demand for construction workers and the need for young women in construction, we will be conducting, or this contract will work with this group to conduct clinics around construction careers for students in Nebraska. So there'll be 2 sites, 1 in Milford and 1 here in Lincoln. It's not just limited to young women, but it is a focus to recruit young women into that. So that's item 4.1. Item 4.2 is around a contract with Edison Creative for an informational video on career education. We get a lot of requests around promotional materials, and as we travel and are working with schools and educators, we haven't for several years updated some of our videos around Nebraska career education with current data. So this contract will be around the development of an informational video on career education in Nebraska. So again, if you have specific questions, I can try to handle them, but Rich would know the specifics as
John?
possible.
Just a quick comment, if I could, Corey. It seems like lately in our news presses and newspapers, there's a lot, if you will, attention given to young ladies, or women, if you will, taking programming, coding courses in high school, with emphasis on that. It seems like this is perfect timing for this to come about.
Absolutely. I think it's really important.
And lastly, the 4.2 with the contractor, will that assist the school counselors in regards to, if you will, assisting them in career paths?
Absolutely, and I think it'll also be helpful for communities and parents. We continue to think about how we speak more broadly around career education and career guidance, and that it's not the sole responsibility of a school counselor, but it's a community effort. So I think yes to every group being able to use it.
Any other questions for Corey? All right, thank you. Next, we'll move on to 4.3. Discuss approval of classification of interim programs. Frida? And she'll also touch base on 4.4 as well. Hi, Frida.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Frida Lang from Accreditation and School Improvement, and tomorrow you'll be asked to grant the Commissioner the authority to approve the classification of the interim program schools as approved to operate for the 2016-17 school year, and that's under Rule 18. Rule 18 contains the regulations and procedures for the approval of the interim program schools in county detention homes, institutions and juvenile emergency shelters. These are residential sites. At this point, we have 17 existing programs. One of those is Boys Town, which has 4 different programs within it, but there's 17 existing programs that operate to serve the educational needs of the students who are placed in those settings. And they're placed there for reasons of health or safety. And to give you kind of a rough idea of the operation of the programs, on any given day in the state, there's approximately 400 students that may be housed in the interim programs. Sometimes fewer, maybe sometimes more. That number is going down over the last year because of changes that have been made in our judicial system. The average length of stay in an interim program is 15 to 20 days, at which time the courts typically adjudicate students' placement. Many of them go back home or to their their school back home. Typically, during that time when they're there, though, statute requires that they receive educational services, and so that's what our interim programs do. The majority of the students pass through one of 5 of the programs, and those are the juvenile justice centers that are on the list that you received. And those would include the Lancaster County Youth Services Center, Northeast Nebraska Juvenile Services, which is in Madison, Douglas County Youth Center, which is in Omaha. In Papillion, we've got the Patrick J. Thomas Juvenile Justice Center, and in Scottsbluff, we've got PACES. So those where the majority of our students are. So do note, these are not our special purpose schools. Our special purpose schools are where students are there and they receive the full array of services, and they can actually graduate from a special purpose schools. Those will come up to you next month. These are the interim programs.
Frida, what's the age range?
They can be usually it's, 12 through 17, 18.
Frida, have you ever done any studies related to the interim program schools to see their efficacy and kind of track kids and see if they end up going back to graduate? And do we ever do anything for the at-risk youth that are participating?
We have not at the department. Again, it's usually such short term.
Yeah.
So it's hopefully we have a liaison that will go to the school or contacts the school to have as much continuity as possible within what's already happening in the school.
I guess this morning we were talking about strategic planning. We were talking about the personalized learning plans and possibility of digital backpacks. And I think if you think about this, in this Rule 18, it would be perfect if we could really try to advocate for their, personalized learning plans regardless of where their physical location is. Because I do believe in western Nebraska there aren't as many sites, so people have to travel and then stay in a different interim program, and sometimes it disrupts education. I don't know if you care about that, but I think that's important.
I would say we definitely care about that, and I think
Maybe
that's
the
a
data
definite
might be a
direction.
good idea.
All right, do you want to continue on with item 4?
Item 4, I certainly will.
Thank
Okay.
you, Frida.
And this is a different area.
Mhm.
So tomorrow I'm going to ask you again to grant the commissioner the authority, in this case, to approve the accreditation for the educational service units that appear on the list that is attached. And that's for them to operate in the 2016-17 school year. As you know, there's at this point 17 educational service units across the state. They've all submitted statements of assurance indicating compliance over the last year with the provisions of Rule 84. And based on those assurance statements and the review of staff qualifications, their annual reports, and other relevant documents such as their external reviews that are done on a 5-year basis. All of the service units at this point are found to be in compliance with Rule 84 and therefore should be entitled to be accredited for the 2016-17 school year.
Any questions or comments? Lily?
What year did the ESU program start?
Well, they were established in 1965.
Yeah.
Many of them went into effect in 1968, 67, 68 basically.
Impressive.
But it's been just fairly recent that we've done the accreditation process. About how many years would you say that we've done the Rule 84?
Oh, well, the Rule of 84 has been in existence for, you probably answer that, Matt. I mean,
I knew you
What
were
if-
gonna look at
few
me.
years.
Quite a while?
Because we just revised it in
Okay.
2012. But
Okay.
prior to that, it had been in the early 90s when it was first developed.
But there was probably 30 years or so where there wasn't an accreditation process in place with ESUs. Would that be, if it was the 90s that it first came into
Right.
play, that
Mhm.
that kind of process was
When
in place?
I worked in a service unit and I came on and they made us accountable.
Is that how it happened? Okay.
Maybe, I don't know.
So, can I?
I think I worked in them before they were.
Before they were accountable?
Yeah.
So I might add one thing, just as you all know, I mean, my past history at working, in fact, I was the first executive director of the ESU Coordinating Council. And at that time, and Frida and I worked very closely together on those things of reviewing Rule 84. And there's an effort, part of Rule 84 that currently exists is joint planning efforts between the Department of Education and the ESU Coordinating Council with all of the ESUs present. And it's a really important process for us. We've watched that develop. I mean, I was able to, and Frida and I in different roles at that point, were able to try to facilitate processes where we really looked at our data differently, where we started to say what are the important things that our schools need. So the EBA process, for instance, right, was one of the focuses we just had in an April meeting with our ESUs, talking about what type of supports the schools were actually requesting, looking and examining our schools that are, especially those that needs improvement, and how we're trying to work with our ESUs in different ways. And there's still much more work to do to organize that capacity, but very, very important work. It might at some point necessitate a little more conversations around Rule 84 and those expectations and how we lay that out. But I think we continue to build a really remarkable partnership that you don't see across the country between these intermediate agencies and the State Department of Education. And we continue to want to facilitate that. But it's really a very important piece of our capacity for the state and for the benefit of our schools.
I was just going to say, in our last meeting we had in our breakout sessions, 16 out of 17 came to the AQuest data conference. So obviously your system-wide talk about every student every day is really playing out in that communication level.
Yeah, it's important.
Well, it might be worthy of note too, of the 17 units over the last 6 years, 13 of those 17 have voluntarily chosen to pursue regional accreditation through Advanced
Wow.
Ed, which means they will have on their external reviews, people are on those teams from outside of the state. And in turn, there's many of our ESU staff members who are participating in external reviews in other states, and it's a great professional development opportunity.
Great. Any other questions? Thanks, Frida. We will move on to item 5. An agreement between the Department of Health and Human Services with Federal Fiscal 2015 Child Care Development Block Grant Funds. Hello, Melody.
Good afternoon. As you know, I'm Melody Hobson. I'm the administrator of the Office of Early Childhood. And if you remember, I was here last month asking you to authorize the commissioner to negotiate and sign an agreement with Health and Human Services. And last month, it was for the 2014 fiscal year money. This is the 2015 fiscal year money. HHS and I work pretty closely together, and sometimes it takes a little longer than we necessarily anticipate, but we're making good progress. 2 years and 2 months, I think. But this is, again, this is the money. This is quality set-aside money that states are required to set aside a portion of the CCDBG money for quality improvement activities. And for since the block grant was first funded, Health and Human Services and the Department of Education have worked together for that. The funding does pay for some staffing in the Department of Education, and in turn it also pays for some contracting work and creating training. Working on it helps fund the professional development partnerships across the state, the whole regional training system. It works. It helps support the ECICC, which is the Early Childhood Interagency Coordinating Council, and we are constantly approving training for child care providers. We have a library for a free loan for any provider across the state that wants some professional development. They can browse through the electronic catalog and ask to check out some stuff, and it's free, and all they have to do is return it to us. And so we do this really does help support a lot of the professional development that happens in the state for child care providers, some for Head Start, and quite a lot also for school district operated early childhood programs.
Any questions of Melody? Thank you, and great progress. 2 years and 2 months. Wow. We'll now move on to item 6, discuss Nebraska Council on Teacher Education State Board Representative selection. And Pat, hello.
Good afternoon. For the record, I am Pat Madsen, Nebraska Department of Education Adult Program Services. We were here last month to ask you for nominations for the board-appointed member on the Nebraska Council on Teacher Education. There has been a vacancy, and we did receive one application, which is included in your materials. So tomorrow we will be asking you to confirm that that appointment. So, any questions?
No questions.
Okay,
All right, thanks, Pat. Next, we'll move on to item 7, Brent, and that's discuss approval of a contract with Phenom Blue. Oops, where's
Lost
Brent? We lost Brent. Okay.
It's actually Phenom Blue. Maybe
Phenom.
I'll give
Thank
him a little
you.
background. We'll see if he
Okay.
makes it. But
And we do need this, I believe.
Yeah, so with this particular contract, we actually went out and did an RFP for various vendors to look at our website and had several presentations on that, selecting Phenom Blue out of that. If you look at our website, and I know you do, and it's actually one of those things where the design of it is probably 10 or more years old. And archaic, yeah, that's probably, and a little bit tough to manage. Plus, we really believe that this is the moment in time to start to organize that information in the benefit of strategic planning, the benefit of what we're trying to do around communications ultimately. And so Brent and our communications team kind of pulled this effort together and then present this as a recommendation to the board. Here he is, though. I saw he even wore blue.
I thought Sharon Cott was coming in before, so I thought I had time. That's what I get from
I gave a good overview. I don't know.
Well, for the record, as I come running in, I'm Brent Gasser from the Network and Technology team. I'm here today for the first time to ask you to help approve a contract tomorrow. And to explain this contract a little bit more, you're probably wondering what Phenom Blue is. We've decided, if you've looked at our website, if you've navigated our website, you may have found it less than user-friendly, maybe hard to find information. In the 8 years that I've been here, we've never really had a strategic plan. We've never really looked at how can we make that better. And it's easy to say it's just about the website, but this is really about a whole lot more than just a website because there's so much behind it. So we have a committee that started looking at our web environment, how we can make it better for our users this year. And the committee felt, this is bigger than any other thing we can do internal. We really need somebody, an expert from industry, to come in and really help us talk to external clients, the internal users, get all those people into the room, get input, and look at how we can do things better. From staffing, currently we have 50 people across the floor that help put content into our web environment. That's not necessarily the best approach, so how can we staff better? How about our systems, our servers? How are we doing those? Should we be looking at some new industry standards? And then what types of things should we be doing with the website? So the committee went ahead and had us put out an RFI, or a request for information, since we weren't really sure what companies might be out there that would do this type of work for us. We did receive 3 responses from companies. After that, we had 2 of the companies that we selected come in, do presentations for us. The committee scored them, and out of that we picked Phenon Blue, which is out of Omaha. And they have a process that they actually take companies through around planning to really think about what it is your needs are. And what they're going to do for us is they'll come in, they'll work with our staff, we'll go to their facilities, they'll really listen to what we're saying we need, what our needs are. They'll look at our users, our clients from external, what they're saying their needs are. And then they're going to give us a solution or recommendations of next steps of what they think we should do, how we should structure our staffing, what types of systems we should invest in, and how that website should be developed for future use to be more future ready. So what we're asking you for is the approval to contract with them to begin that process. And we felt this is a good time because it'll also go very well after the strategic planning is finished, so we can build on what that is done in this way, so we know we're supporting those issues as well.
Glenn?
You know, one of the things that came out of the strategic planning was people wanted more educational data, and that was never really defined. What is that educational data? You go out there, and there is a lot of information out there, a lot of data about NISA scores, and I actually got a phone call from a dad who had downloaded the spreadsheet and was doing his analysis and everything like that, and I hope part of this process delivers information to them so that they don't have to do all that kind of, because he may be the only parent I know that has ever gone to that level of effort to produce information from all that data. Right. So I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Molly?
As one member of the data committee, I just want to compliment you. This is just a huge innovation for Nebraska Department of Ed to have more immediate transparency with our consumers, whether they're students, parents, or just community members. And I hope as the dashboard advisor is developed, it's incorporated in alignment with AQuest, in alignment with your new website, so people can tap into the different tenants and kind of look at best practices. Thank you.
Yep. We'll definitely keep Dean and his team involved in that. Make sure we're working closely with them.
Any other comments? Thank you, Brent.
Thank you.
Okay, next we are going to be doing items 8 through, we have a lot of them, through 16. And so Mark will walk us through each of these items that we have, since he is pretty busy. So thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Again, my name is Mark Schultz. I'm the director of Nebraska VR. I'm going to start with item 4.8 because it's a little bit different than the others. And 4.8 is actually, we're going to be seeking the authority for the commissioner to approve a contract with Monroe Meyer Institute to serve as a designated state entity for the Nebraska Statewide Independent Living Council. And under WIOA, there was a change in how the Nebraska Statewide Independent Living Council and Part B funds are handled. And on the federal level, that whole program moved over to the Adult and Community Living Program under HHS. So it's no longer under the Department of Education at the federal level. And so we worked with them to look for another designated state entity at this level because the contract moves to more of a fiscal agent and rather than an active participant in the planning process. So we felt like that would put us in a more of a conflicting role with the CELC, and we'd be a better partner if there were another designated state entity for that fiscal management and accountability role. So this would move that forward, and then in future years it would just be appropriated at the legislative budgeting level. So if there are any questions.
Just continue on, Mark.
Okay. And then items 4.9 through 4.16 I'm going to cover those in general, and then if you have any specific questions, I think that would be the quickest way to move that along. Again, with WIOA, we are required to set aside 15% of our federal dollars for a specific set of services called pre-employment transition services. So this is one of our strategies to pull in some partners to help us with some new activities around reaching out to students around 5 core things. And those are to do job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, workplace readiness training, post-secondary training and college exploration, and then instruction in self-advocacy. So we went through a request for proposal process. There was a very quick turnaround. We received 18 proposals, of which you're seeing 9 contracts for 10 projects today. And then there are additional 6 projects that are being funded that are under $25,000. So all told, we are funding all but 2 of those that submitted proposals. So it's just under $500,000 worth of activities that we're going to be conducting with students with disabilities across the state between June and the end of September this year. So we're pretty excited about it. It's a great opportunity to work directly with those students. And we have projects that will run across from the western part of the state all the way to the eastern part. So I can run through each one, but I think I'd rather just take a specific
So that's what we talked about with all of these. If you have any specific or general questions about the direction that Mark and VR is moving, or if you have any specific questions about items 9 through item 16, if you had any specific, Glenn?
So I'm guessing this spent the entire 15% allotment
No.
then? Oh, it did not, okay.
No, and actually it would require us to spend about $2.5 million. And we have staff that are out there working in the schools now, and so that will count towards that required expenditure. And we provide some funding to students who are working as part of their work experience. They're in an on-the-job evaluation or on-the-job training, we'd call that. So there are some, but Nebraska, as many states are experiencing right now because of this mandated set-aside, we're going to struggle with spending it. And most states are finding that it's taking them 2 years to expend that 15% specifically for these services. That's going to create some problems for us as we move forward because we didn't get any additional money. So that 15% comes out of services to adults and to students as well who don't fall within this very prescriptive definition of students eligible for pre-employment transition services. So we are doing some work. I serve as the president of our association, so we are working at the federal level to try to get some language because we understand from the congressional staff that were involved in drafting this, that was not their intent, was to have this so narrowly defined. So we're trying to get that broadened so that states aren't in a position of having a difficult time expending these dollars for a very narrow set of students. So we're working on that.
Molly?
I'm going to make a reference to, I think it's 4.11, and it's talking about spending this to serve 30 students with disabilities in Lincoln, cooperation with the ARC of Lincoln Autism Family Network. Autism is a subject I hear across the state, and there's sometimes a hard challenge to find resources for students with autism, and this is students with disabilities 14 to 21 years. You were talking about expending that 15%. Is there any talk in VR about extending outreach for students with autism in other areas?
Absolutely. We started several years back with the ARA funding, if you remember that when it came available, and we were able to create a project in Omaha with the Autism Center of Nebraska, and they provided support employment services to youth with autism. And that was very successful, and we were able to convince them to expand that to Lincoln, and we're hoping that at some point they will expand that to Grand Island. We did work with a couple of...
Keep going west.
Yeah, but we are trying to find agencies or entities that are willing to work with us to provide those services. So it takes a unique set of skills and training to be able to do that. So.
And Mark, that was my concern on my notes that I took when I read through this was we really aren't going anywhere past Lincoln, west of Lincoln. as such with this autism?
Not with this particular, with 4.11, but our staff provide those services.
Right.
So it's, we are out there in the schools, working with the schools, and we fill those gaps where
Right.
we need to. So we would like to increase the availability of providers across the state, so hopefully through these
And that's
kinds of
what I was
activities, we
referring
can do
to.
that. Yeah.
So thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
All right. Took us through 16. I think what we'll keep going. No, we'll take a short break because I don't see our next. Let's do that. Let's do a 5-minute break, and then we'll move on to item 5. And we'll find. And we'll find. Yeah. And I will turn it over to the Commissioner regarding AQuest and update on priority schools.
Yes, and thank you. First of all, obviously with priority schools, we have a lot going on, and if you remember from what our kind of statutory timeline is, that we'll bring back plans at the August board meeting for your approval ultimately in the work in these 3 schools. So with Druid Hill, Santee, and with Loup County, each one of them we've had folks working with them closely. I've got a couple of our team members here. We got Frida Lang and Sue Anderson. We've also had, I guess Corey Epler has been kind of one of our leads for Druid Hill. We've also had Matt Huseman as a lead for Loup County, and April Phillips as a lead for Santee. Dr. Friesen probably do a little bit more of this if she happened to be here today, but she's providing some leadership in that arena as well. I wanted to give you just a sense of the update. We've had kind of some interactions throughout the last several months with each school individually, including opportunities to meet with either the board members and certainly administration, even with teachers. We've been visible and present in the school settings at each place in different ways. We ended up doing something we called a diagnostic review. In fact, there's a consultant that did some of that work with us, Kathy Kennedy, that reviewed that. And we went through a process where we kind of had the observations of what's happening, what's working, what's not. I will tell you, the frame of AQuest is actually a very, very good frame for us to be able to be working in schools around improvement and starting to build these plans that will align with what our expectations are around AQuest, number one. But also, I think in just the right processes. And I can speak I spent some time with the Santee board myself quite a few different times, and what you find is remarkable, and I think the same is true in each one of our priority schools. They have special unique circumstances that we have to adapt to and build a plan around for each one of them. So we'll come back in June with a little bit more detail. I wanted to give you a little highlight of where that work's going. I don't know if Frida and Sue, if you want to say anything about the process overall, or if you have any questions maybe about where we're at process-wise, Frida and Sue can both help me answer those. But it's been very important and very informative about how we think about interacting with schools at this level. Never before in the Department of Education's history have we had a process like this, where our intention is to go in and actually provide that level of thoughtful input and support and direction and guidance in a very different way. And so that will be reflected as individual plans that come back to you in August ultimately for your approval around that. So I guess I take questions, and I know Frida and Sue can help me answer any of those questions. So.
Any questions, Molly?
Sue, I thought it was so fun when you were talking about the AQuest data meeting, and you said out of our needs improvement schools, I believe you said 39 of 46 attended. So what I wanted to compliment you and the Nebraska Department of Ed is it's not a stick. It's AQuest and the needs improvement and the priority schools are just an opportunity for support. So could you share a little bit about the priority schools and needs improvement and how AQuest is really lifting them out of that classification?
Okay, I think I'm following that point in our discussion earlier. What I shared in the domain meeting was that we had planned the sessions for the AQuest conference in response to the information we heard from the needs improvement as well as other classifications in terms of areas of support that they would request. And so one of the stats I shared was that I believe we have 45 districts that have at least one needs improvement school. And of those 45, we had 39 districts in attendance at the conference. And we had 190 of our districts in attendance at the conference. Out of 245 districts. So we felt that schools were really responding to opportunities for support and to learn more about improvement. So I'm not sure if that's what you intended me to share. And we had our needs improvement representation from Loup County and Santee schools, both in attendance at the conference. So.
Any other questions? Pat?
More comment, and I apologize, I missed this morning's strategic planning, and I don't know whether this might have come up, but, you know, the priority schools, obviously, I hope we learn a lot from, and I hope we're successful there, but I think it's very important for us to aggressively address those needs improvement schools, and I think we've got to be very aggressive in formulating a way to work with those schools, and that should be built into our strategic plan. If it's not, it just concerns me. You know, we obviously got our charge by the legislature for the priority schools. When you got a number of schools like we do have that come under the needs improvement category, I think it's incumbent upon this board and this organization to address those in a very aggressive way. So I hope we'll be able to do that.
Yeah, I actually really concur in a lot of our conversations around how we go forward in supporting those needs improvement schools. And if you remember, even when we selected the priority schools, we kind of had those 4 basic areas that we identified: Native American schools, kind of our traditional rural declining enrollment schools, are some of our urban schools, and our demographically shifting ones. We've really been looking at that. A lot of credit again to Sue and the team members across the department for thinking about support systems in particular for those needs improvement schools. And I've said it before, I guess I could say it here publicly, but I've told staff this: if we did nothing as a Department of Education but support our 87 needs improvement schools for their improvement, we would be the best Department of Education in the country. And I say that quite in a meaningful way, because I think that is how important that work really is, and how we're really lifting that up through what we're doing in policy and what we're doing across the agency and what we're doing in our strategic plan. And so I am pretty sure I could have staff say that they've heard me say that before. So.
Pat, I think you bring up a good point, and I think that's where we're really at a kind of a crossroads as we move forward with strategic planning, with what's happening with AQuest, with what's happening with ESSA. We have an opportunity, I think, tomorrow as we learn more deeply about some things with ESSA and start to think about it. It gives us that opportunity to think about how we prioritize the needs improvement schools and how we learn from this first step of the action plans. And so I'm assuming that you're going to present in June kind of a draft action plan, or does the action plan come to us in August? Can you just walk through a little bit of what you envision seeing, one of you, over the next June and then into August meeting?
Yeah, in fact, there's kind of some basic principles that obviously that we'll present that we're seeing across each one of them, and our work that we've already done. We're actually trying to fill voids where voids seem to exist, and already in that work, you know, that the planning process itself is part of the improvement process, we hope, right? That we're trying to lift up and hold that up. So each one of them have a little bit different circumstances. In one case with Druid Hill, we're working very closely with Omaha Public Schools as a district. That's a unique relationship for the department. So we'll present kind of how we're doing that with Druid Hill, but we'll also talk about how it's working in Loup County. Loup County has a certain set of circumstances, their ruralness, their size, their scale, the kind of the perception of what what accountability means and what accreditation means in that setting looks a little bit different. And Santee has its own very unique circumstances. So that we'll kind of have this overarching thing and then specific pieces of that plan. Some of the elements of the plan are also, I will call it, somewhat sensitive, right? We get down to the granular level of understanding what staff are there and how they're responding to that. Those are things we probably wouldn't want to present so much in a particular plan per se, but it's really important that we're actually functioning in a way that's very meaningful for that process. So there'll be the overarching pieces of that tied to really AQuest is the way that I see it coming together, and maybe Sue can touch on that point.
Well, one of the things that I sort of focused on starting several months ago was the idea of, well, what would a plan like physically look like? Like what could you imagine? And so I did quite a bit of research in terms of that from other states that have similar processes for priority schools. And so basically, I think you can imagine a template that's organized to reflect goals or areas for improvement, specific areas for improvement, with actions and strategies designed to meet those goals for improvement, with timelines associated with the implementation of those strategies, resources required to implement those strategies, person or persons responsible to implement those strategies, and evidence or artifacts to help us know whether those improvements are on track. And so the other piece to imagine is all of those items aligned to one or more of the tenets of AQuest. So an example might be if there is an area of improvement related to instruction. Let's say it would relate to adopting and implementing an instructional model. Let's say that was an identified area. Of course, that would align to our tenet of educator effectiveness. And so we would format this plan so that it would be easy to see not only what the school would be doing and how it would be doing those things, but how those activities and actions are aligned to our system for AQuest. Does that kind of help?
Yeah, I think maybe, and when you come back in June, then, that may be helpful to see, because I do think as we look at the responsibility, I think it's important for all of us to have a good understanding and not end up with a plan that maybe we expected something different. So I think in June, that would be very helpful to give, sample school A, here's what a plan may look like, if we're not actually reviewing the plans until August, and when we're then also approving the plan. So I think it would be advantageous to make sure that we all have a good understanding of what we're going to be looking at in a plan. So when we get to that point, we're comfortable and not at that last moment where we need to approve a plan, have a lot of questions about the plan. Does that make sense? I think that's really important for us, from my perspective. I'll go John and then you, Molly.
See, Frida, can we assume that these plans coming up for our priority schools, will they include milestones and action plans to be carried out, at the discretion of the planners per se?
The action plans and the other, I'm sorry.
For our plans for our priority schools?
That's our intent. And
Okay.
Yes.
So in other words, we should get pretty much of a schedule in regards to action for the future.
Right, and I also,
Okay.
yes, because I think in the plan, the intent is to show a timeline. And I think it's important to realize too that these plans will reflect more than just the next 12 months, that some of these improvements will take longer than maybe 1 year to accomplish. So we're looking at over time. But my understanding is that those plans would then be resubmitted the following year in order for the board to see growth and progress. And yeah.
Thank you.
Earlier today, we got the improvement timeline for the AQuest, the EBAs, and I thought it was really interesting. Is Matt in the room? No. Anyway, I was just going to draw a parallel to the action plans for our priority schools. It was interesting how he said they have like a hypothesis and then they do a reiteration when you get feedback. But the way that Rachel just said it is they're going to have the plan and then next year they'll do an update. But in a lot of companies I know, you have a plan, you start getting the data in, and then you reiterate your hypothesis and make some adjustments. Will there be any intermediate plan adjustments?
I'm sure that there will be.
Because I just,
Right.
when you're saying make sure we know the plan is what we want and why did it happen, I was just going to say, I hope there's room for reiteration if the hypotheses change based on data that comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Pat?
Well, to go back to something that Patrick said, and we were talking about the strategic planning part of it, it was very encouraging to me this morning when we were talking about the things that had come forth from our external people that we had talked to, or the FSG had talked to across the state, that things like professional development were coming out. People were asking for professional development and more of it. And, you know, I think those kinds of things that are coming out in our strategic plan is certainly going to support what we're doing for those low-performing schools. So I think it's coming together, and I was real pleased to see that.
All right. Any other questions or comments, Commissioner?
Oh,
Frida, Sue?
thanks to
Thank
Frida and
you,
Sue for
Frida.
being here.
Thank you, Sue. All right, we will move on to item 2, teaching and learning, and I will turn it over to Maureen. And I don't know if just Maureen or Maureen and Ryan? Just Maureen. Okay, not Ryan. Okay, Maureen, it's all yours.
Well, we had some great discussion in our teaching and learning domain meeting earlier. And I'm just going to give just a short synopsis of each of the 3 tenets that we did updates on. On the college and career ready tenet, we reviewed the science standards process and the comparison of current science standards with the next generation science standards, since that will be starting this summer. And Sarah led us through what a next generation science lesson would look like, and it was wonderful, and it's the route to go. Thank you, Sarah. Under Educator Effectiveness, our update on activities related to the tenet went around the survey of the Department of Ed and ESU staff revealed 3 themes of activities. 1, supporting school leadership with implementation of an evaluation framework. The second one, encouraging teacher growth. The third one, collective efforts around educator effectiveness. And we are going to be bringing forth much more information at the August meeting around this particular tenet. Under the assessment tenet, we did a survey of administrators. There was discussion of the survey of administrators for input on assessment. There was discussion around the bridge year recommendations around assessment, and the assessment vision process planning. And in June, there'll be some decision-making points around assessment contracts. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Glen Flint to talk about the college and career.
All right. A couple years ago, I was out in Alliance having breakfast at Ken and Dale's, and I bumped into my 4th grade science teacher. We reminisced about the old times, and he mentioned that he had a lab with every class, and I don't remember all of them, but I'm sure he does after having done them for several years. And that's kind of the experience we went through this morning, and so I'm going to call up Corey and Sarah to tell us more about this next generation science standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, for the record, I'm Corey Epler, Senior Administrator for Teaching and Learning.
And I'm Sarah Cooper, the Science Education Specialist.
And I'm really excited to have Sarah here and let you all meet Sarah, because I talk a lot about the amazing staff that we get to work with day in and day out, and I'm convinced that Sarah is really going to push us where we need to be when we talk about science education. Her passion, her knowledge, her expertise, we saw it today in the domain committee, and perhaps even fun associated with learning about and learning in regards to science. So I want to talk through some specifics regarding the science process in regards to revision of the Nebraska science standards. I'm going to probably cruise through some information that we've talked about quite consistently when it comes to standards development and revision of standards. This information is posted in the e-materials as well, but we are required by statute to adopt academic content standards in for at least the grade levels required for state assessment, and the statute includes that for reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. And as of last year, the revision for content area standards moves from 5 years to 7 years. As the standards are approved or adopted by the State Board of Education, pursuant to that revised statute, school districts will have a year to adopt the state-approved content standards or adopt content standards that are deemed equal to or more rigorous than the state-approved content standards. But we hear often from our commissioner that it's important to move beyond the minimums. And so even though we do and are required by law to develop standards in those specific content areas, currently we do have content standards for all content areas at the department. This is nothing new. We have standards in place for all of these areas. It's just some of them haven't been touched or reviewed or revised for a few years, so we are moving through the process of reviewing and revising all of those. So I just wanted to point out that we have standards in every content area. These are not required by law, so we simply encourage school districts to adopt them. And what we've seen is that school districts have appreciated the leadership of the department in bringing forward the expertise around the development of these content standards in these areas. So part of our charge as we move towards science, and we had a good conversation around college, career, and civic readiness this afternoon as well, and thinking about what that definition may look like. So currently we're operating from college and career ready, and this is the definition we brought forth with the mathematics standards. But we are going to begin considering what it may look like as we move towards college, career, and civics readiness. And I think that's a really important point that we talked about this morning, and thinking about what that may look like and being intentional about that as we move forward with our standards development. So our standards will be college and career ready for sure as we move forward, thinking about what the piece of civics readiness attached to those standards would look like as well. We use a consistent process, which you're all familiar with, engaging Nebraska educators, our post-secondary institutions, business and industry, maintaining communication with our state board as well as public input. We know that's something that's really critically important. We often talk about the difference between standards and curriculum. At the state level, the state board will determine standards and indicators. This is a little bit of a change from mathematics and English language arts, because what we're trying to do is to create a consistent terminology across all content areas. So our teaching and learning team has worked to identify the levels of measurement within our content, within our learning standards. So we didn't all agree, but we agreed that we all could live with 2 levels of standards development, and they will be called standards and indicators. We hope a consistent terminology will promote interdisciplinary teaching and learning, as well as provide just additional guidance around what exactly we mean when we're talking standards. So that's something that's a little bit different than previous years. But again, local curriculum instructional decisions are determined and left to our local school districts as well. I have information regarding our team's definition of standard as well as indicator. I'm not going to get into that today specifically because we have that information there, but we're just trying to really calibrate what we mean, and that's been a really intentional and deliberate conversation, and I think something that I hope is appreciated as well as we work across all content areas. We hear often that we must develop standards that meet a high level of quality. In fact, that's something that we're challenged on consistently. So again, our team is working to think about a quality checklist for content area standards. And this is a list of items that our team has said our standards should meet these criteria. I've attached more detailed information around this checklist in the e-meetings agenda as well. And what we're going to do is put the research base behind it. We've started that process. Our hope is it'll be done this summer. So when someone comes to us and says, your standards are not of high quality, we've got the research base that backs why we've adopted and built the standards the way that we have done. We think this is important. We think it's critical because we know that we've been very deliberate and intentional about the development of our content standards, and we do think they are high quality, and we're going to put the educational research and theory behind it that shows that they do meet a high quality piece. So that will hopefully be done by the end of this summer, something we're also really looking forward to do. I know that was really quick, but I want to get into the meat of the conversation around Nebraska's college and career ready for science. I'm going to have Sarah talk a little bit about Nebraska's historical perspective, where we're at, and then also lead us into this conversation around a framework for K-12 science education from a national perspective.
Thank you, Corey. So our current Nebraska standards were adopted in 2010. Our science standards actually originated for the first time in 1998. The guiding documents for our standards in science since 1998 were the benchmarks for scientific literacy, which were produced in 1993. From the benchmarks, the National Science Education Standards were produced. Both of those documents had input from the scientific community, educators, all of our national science organizations, as well as educational researchers. Currently, replacing those historical documents, in particular the benchmarks for scientific literacy, we have the framework for K-12 science education that was published by the National Research Council in 2012. AAAS, again, the national science organizations, science educators, science faculty at institutions of higher ed were critical in creating the framework. In the framework, they identified 3 pieces that are essential to science education: disciplinary core ideas, science and engineering practices, and cross-cutting concepts. I would like to highlight that those are not new ideas. And if we go back to the benchmarks and we go back to the National Science Education Standards, we'll see that those 3 pieces are there. We have content. Science and engineering practices were called inquiry, and the cross-cutting concepts were unifying themes. What's new in the framework is that the science and engineering practices replaced inquiry, and the reason for that was that inquiry was ambiguous. And it led to teaching this is how we do science, and the scientific method is the first chapter in a textbook, and not actually using those practices and skills to learn science. And the cross-cutting concepts replacing the unifying themes, those were just kind of pushed aside and not viewed as important. The research supporting, there's educational research and what we know about how children learn, how students learn, have reinforced this idea that these 3 pieces are essential, and it's essential that they be woven together, and that standards have to have all 3 pieces.
And I think that's one thing that we see as problematic when we build standards in a silo. And I use the career readiness standards as an example in our domain meeting, because we have the Nebraska career readiness standards. And we're being intentional and have been intentional about embedding those standards within our content area standards, so they're not something extra, that they are just part of the standard. And so what the framework for K-12 science education has done is it's embedded those 3 pieces. They're together. It's not you do this, this, or this. The one piece is the 3 of those items coming together for really that 3-dimensional approach to learning science into science education. And I think that's important because I share a quote from the National Research Council that science isn't just a body of knowledge that reflects current understanding of the world. It's a set of practices used to establish, extend, and refine that knowledge. And we believe that, and we think that's important for our students to not just learn science or just to do science, but what we did today was a shift from learning about to figuring out. I will say Glenn, he was kind of our star student today. He was because the experience was designed around density, and the word density wasn't even used until the end, until Glenn said it. He said, "This is density." And I think that proves Sarah's point perfectly, because it was something that he discovered, he figured out. And so that's our approach is, congratulations, there's no prize.
He got an A today.
Yeah, exactly. But we think
And
that
did we
that's...
determine that was 4th grade level?
Yeah, it was at the 4th grade level. But that's why we think it's really that we're at this pivotal time in science education in Nebraska to create a set of standards that don't just allow students to learn, but allow them to figure it out, and to create experiences for them that will create the next generation of scientists that are prepared for post-secondary education, but also the workforce, and thinking about the demands of our workforce as well. one of the outgrowths of the K-12 science education framework are the next generation science standards. And so I know that that's something that is pretty common. We hear a lot about NGSS, as they're commonly referred to. Those standards were built from that framework, so those three pieces embedded together. The thing that is important to understand about these, the NGSS, is that they were developed by educators and stakeholders in science, developed and guided by post-secondary education and business and industry expectations. So we have just a short 3-minute video. Do you want to go ahead and, is that okay, Glenn? All right. Glenn, that kind of highlights these particular standards.
When people are first introduced to the next generation science standards,
So
they're
pause.
stunned.
It's like the voice from behind.
So while they're pausing, I will point out that in the development of those standards, Nebraska was represented. The current dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at UNL, Dr. Francisco, sits on the Board of Science Education, National Board of Science Education. He was involved in this process, as well as the, and I'm going to get it wrong right now without looking at it, the Nebraska Religious Coalition for Science was also involved.
When people are first introduced to the next generation science standards, there's stunned silence. And then there's squirming in the chair, and people start to get antsy, but in a positive way. And then people respond with, oh my gosh, this is wonderful, this is cool, this is great.
This is an unprecedented time in education in the United States.
Standards in themselves, the total document, the next generation, has the power to influence all of the components of the education system.
See, normally we teach out of context. The biology teacher is teaching here, the mathematics teacher there, the English teacher over here. And then when it's time to synthesize, guess what? We aren't there.
The next generation standards are based upon research, current research, on how students learn.
Science isn't just a mere bunch of facts. You know, science is about the way we think about the world, the way we question the world, the way we communicate about the world. And that piece alone, developing that, is a huge piece of the new standards.
We're really looking at the next generation science standards to propel students into 21st century. So you're looking at college readiness, you're looking at career readiness.
Why is now the time for the next generation science standards? We're past the time for the next generation standards.
To be competitive globally, we need to prepare our students.
We have to have as a solid, firm foundation that framework for K-12 science education from the scientific community.
I'm one of the writing team members, and my job is to assist with the development of the standards, which is connected to the framework.
Minnesota is a lead state, so as part of that, I've convened together groups. We have some groups that are working as reviewers of the standards. We have 2 other groups, one that's sort of dealing with communications with the business and industry side, also looking at what it would take to implement the standards in Minnesota. And then another group who is looking at communications mostly with educators and especially around the framework document.
Our standards need to be able to help our students face a world that we're not currently facing right now.
We're never going to reach perfection, I don't believe, because the world is changing. We need to continue evolving and changing with our ever-changing world.
When a teacher loves something, the students are going to love it too.
Teachers have to be open-minded. They have to be willing to take a risk. They have to be willing to get messy. They're going to have to be willing to let the students lead a little.
This is it's a very hard thing, it's a very critical thing, but it's a very rewarding thing too.
It's awesome to see the kids working together and talking to each other and supporting what they think with evidence that they've seen. It is so major cool.
It's going to change the way that I teach, and it's scary, and yet at the same time it's exciting. I think it's going to reinvigorate my teaching.
I'm very excited to see that transition, that change to actually doing science.
The human capital is the most prized resource that this nation possesses, and we can ill afford the luxury of not developing it to its maximum capacity.
So one of the things that we've done as we think about the next generation science standards is we have worked with McREL to complete a comparison between the 2010 Nebraska Science Standards and the Next Generation Science Standards. In your information that's on the e-meetings, there are 3 documents from this comparison. There's an executive summary, of which I have a hard copy here for. There's the full report, and there's also the qualifications of the McREL analysis, their background in terms of their qualifications to complete the work as well. I wanted to share a few specific things with you today because this report we will be sharing with our broad teacher audience as well because they're very interested in this. We were specifically interested in content of our current science standards as well as the cognitive complexity within both documents. Cognitive complexity is measured by depth of knowledge. Webb's depth of knowledge, which we talked about, is measured 1 through 4, 1 and 2 typically being lower levels of cognition, 3 and 4 getting more into the higher levels in the application. As we look at the document, and I've got a couple graphs that I'll share with you, what we found is that in our 2010 Nebraska Science Standards, the majority of indicators across all grade levels were present in the Next Generation Science Standards. You can see the analysis in this chart. So the content that's in our current standards is reflected in the Next Generation Science Standards. Some things that are particularly important to note when Sarah was talking about those core ideas, those that content. We also were specifically interested in information in Next Generation Science Standards that was not addressed by the 2010 standards for Nebraska. And for the most part at the K2 and 3-5 levels, we're in pretty good shape. When we get to the 6-8 and 9-12, that's where we start to see that there are several core ideas that are in Next Generation Science Standards that are not in our current set of standards. What I think is interesting is the notable gaps include specifically around engineering, technology and application of science, as well as earth and space science. So you can see the breakdown across the chart. The final chart that I'll show you examines the depth of knowledge. So again, thinking about cognitive complexity and depth of thinking. As we look at the comparison between our standards and Next Generation of Science Standards, we notice that the depth of knowledge required in NGSS is at a much higher level than our current science standards. And specifically, when you look at our middle school and high school levels, and specifically 9-12, the majority of our standards were identified at levels 1 and 2. The majority of standards in NGSS was identified at 3 and 4. So that highlights that there's a lot of opportunity for us to raise the rigor or complexity within our document as well. So that's why we continue saying we're at a really pivotal point, and I really believe that as we think about how we advance science education. A few highlights that I will point out specifically is that our science standards do not embed the science and engineering practices or cross-cutting practices as NGSS. They're not embedded as nicely as NGSS has them. Again, the content of our science standards reflects most of the content found in NGSS, but notable gaps were found around core ideas, specifically engineering, technology, and applications of science, and earth and space science. What I noted in the committee meeting this morning was that when we consider also this through the lens of workforce development, some of our gaps are some of the specific needs for our workforce in the state. So as we think about growing our talent pipeline of our future engineers, our construction workers, our biologists, our life sciences, we really see that there's an opportunity to strengthen that, for which I'm excited because we again highlight the relationship between education and the workforce, and knowing that our talent pipeline starts in our local schools. So that's something that's pretty important. I'm going to just briefly talk about a few logistics, and then we'll open it up for questions. Our writing team will include K-12 representation from teachers, ESUs, our post-secondary institutions, NDE, as well as community-based organizations that have an interest in science, thinking about extension, the zoo, the museums, our after-school programs as well. A lot of opportunities there. Sarah is a scientist and a mathematician, so she's created a formula, a model, a mathematical model in terms of how we ensure there's equal representation from each ESU. I won't ask her to walk through that, but we are being, you can do that on your in your free time. So each ESU, we've identified the number of writers that we would like to pull from to ensure that we have geographic distribution, not just based on size, but based on number of students and schools within that ESU. The last piece, as far as just high points of our timeline, I do also have a hard copy of the more detailed schedule. It's also posted for you. We've started collecting some feedback from stakeholders around what is science. That was an open-ended question that we posed, and why is science important? We hope within the next 2 weeks that we open, and this is something that we haven't done before on standards, but we open a public input survey before we begin, so we can gather input on our current standards. And I think that's something really important, and Patrick, something we learned from mathematics is we want to engage as many people in this process as possible. We want as many voices informing this. So Sarah's great idea and suggestion around, let's do a survey at the beginning. We'll also do a survey at the end when we have a draft, and then we will also have public input meetings as well. So we're going to try to engage as many voices in this as possible, and we appreciate that suggestion from our mathematics process as well. We'll engage post-secondary education in that process as well. Writing will start this fall. It'll continue through the spring of 17 and through the summer as we get into editing meetings. The summer of 17, we'll work to ensure that our post-secondary education institutions will sign off on them as they've done for mathematics. And our anticipated state board approval of September of 17. And our intent is to have a draft a month before and present that to the board in August, so that the board will have a month to consider the final draft before the vote in September. So we are happy to answer questions. I tried to keep it as concise as possible, but it's also something important too.
Right, John has a question.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Corey, for your enthusiasm. It's pretty obvious. Quick question I have, the aspects of computer science, do they fit in this, or are we using that under mathematics?
Well, computer science, as it is now, is currently falling under career and technical education. So I know specifically the AP computer science courses are in that specific career field, and they're working to redo and update the IT, computer information system standards this summer. But I do think as we think about technology broadly, absolutely, those pieces they show up in those cross-cutting concepts and those science and engineering practices. So
and the engineering and technology standards.
Especially, yeah, with computer engineering? Okay.
Any other questions?
In the next gen science standards, I think it's really exciting, and Sarah, thank you for your work, because with technology changing and just really 21st century skills just requiring that integration and cross-cutting of science, it's going to build that career pathway, and I can see with AQuest how the other tenets will drive more of our students into those high demand areas. And our workforce development, when I look around the state and talk to business leaders and industry, many of them are saying they don't have qualified applicants. So thank you again for grabbing this by the horns and really making science, I would have loved to watch that, science entertaining.
We should have videotaped
And that
it.
practical application, I think it's not just reading about and memorizing, but actually investing the physical part of one's being that makes science come alive. And hopefully there'll be an impetus to get more women in science.
Commissioner?
Yeah, I just want to add one point, and I think when Glenn mentioned density, he was talking about me in that meeting. I think it's just by accident, but the reality, just this this week, or over the past few weeks, we've had many conversations with the governor on the Education Workforce Roundtable, really the replacement for P16, I would call it. But among those elements, on one side of the equation that we're focused on early childhood side, the other side around dual credit and thinking about how we expand educational opportunities. But I'm having this chance to be able to work with Chris Roth from Ranking Manufacturing and the importance of science standards to our businesses across the state. And Corey's done a great job, and the team's done a great job of thinking how we engage those partners in that effort. And so I look at it and appreciate just generally thinking through that process, how we engage more and more folks in the conversation about how it benefits the state of Nebraska as a whole too. And I think that's really remarkable work, so thanks.
Right. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, we need to have a more in-depth report from the Assessment Tenant, and Rachel and Lily, you're up.
Well, we are going to have, I think, the Commissioner and Valerie come up to really talk about the work that they have been, and Jeremy and John. Everybody's coming up. That's perfect.
The gang's all here.
That's perfect. They have been spending a lot of time between the listening sessions at AQuest, surveys that the Commissioner will talk about, looking for information around contract to really start to put together some pieces of some decisions that we'll need to make by June around assessment. And what they'll be talking about really is two different phases. The first is what will we do as a bridge in 2016 and 17, and then what will we do around assessment from 2017 and beyond. So between the information they're sharing, some of the presentation around ESSA will inform us as we look at decisions that we'll make for the bridge next year, and then as we start to plan for 2017 and beyond. So Commissioner and team.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start in the, kind of starting back with the overview. We know we have certain decisions we have to make in order to implement our bridge year that we talked about last year in some detail. And as you recall from last month's meeting, we kind of walked through some of those that we anticipated were important. We also talked last time about the importance of how we completed this year, and I just wanted to kind of say it's gone very, very well in this assessment window, right, on the work that we've had to accomplish in that sense. But we continue to think about what the vision and the direction is for assessment. And so one of the things I wanted to highlight, and it happened at the AQuest conference, I guess it was part of the commissioner listening chat sessions, whatever you wanted to call that. But we had a conversation with those that were there, and quite a few interested folks, as it turned out, on where we were going with assessment, what direction ultimately we hope to be able to go. And it was important for us to listen, but we also decided, given one of the dynamics with LB 930 passing, that we are in a process now of figuring out how we implement a college college entrance exam as part of our high school assessment process. And obviously diving into that process right now, as the law gives us an opportunity to think about how we could use that in our bridge year as well. And so I think I presented that last time as a potential option for us to think about at high school. And so I'll go through a few of the basic recommendations and the basic direction of what we anticipate trying to do for next year. Valerie will go through a little bit of this, which she's handing out for some of the details of what we think we can do within a contract with DRC. Our first question, first decision point, is, are we going to do high school NISA, or are we going to do something else? That's one decision point we'll talk through. We have a decision point around writing yet to make on how we handle writing. We talked last time that we were not going to do online writing at 8th or 11th grade, but we have some other options for you to be able to think about that have an impact. And then ultimately, with a recommendation that for this bridge year that we'd be able to go through DRC to complete this work. And so primarily when you look at what next year would look like, what next year would look like would be this notion that we'd have a fairly scaled back contract with DRC to make sure that we hit our minimum requirements of what the law requires us to do for assessment purposes, but not just about the minimums, because I'm really not about the minimums. How do we actually invest in what our next steps are? How do we have conversations with our practitioners and our schools and our public across the state about what those next steps are. One of the things that we've looked at is we have assessment for grades 3 through 8. Where we have requirements in reading and math and science for 3 through 8, and we would recommend that we go through a process. We've gone through a process, I should say, to field test 5 through 8 reading, writing, I will call it together, in our text-dependent analysis, right? That we've had a very successful run at that. I think Valerie can probably hit on the science, the psychometric science behind all of those efforts. But the reality is that's been successful, and it opens up a couple options of how we think about writing for the future as well. But definitely grades 3 through 8, reading, and this TDA portion, at least for 5 through 8, is part of that proposal and plan. Math, grades 3 through 8, as you would expect, and math on our current standards, which is also a very important part of our process, that we're making sure that we're able to assess the standards that you've adopted as a board. Our science standards, of course, now we're talking about new science standards, but grades 5 and 8 that we're required to do assessments in science as well. And then we have a decision point around how to handle writing. And so I'll just mention it right here. We currently do paper pencil at 4th grade. So one option is that we would continue to do that. Another option is possibly to think differently about using the TDA to use our 8th grade TDA as part of our writing requirement under our state law right now. And that would be an option that we believe is a reasonable option, but something we want to actually ask the field, perhaps survey the field as to what they feel would be appropriate there. Then you get to high school, and high school with 11th grade. And we did a survey of the high school principals and superintendents, and we, in a very short window of time, asked them 4 basic questions. One question being, hey, look, out of ACT, SAT, and Accuplacer being currently what the community colleges are going to use for entrance and placement in community colleges, what were their preferences around that? And as you might suggest or suspect, relative to ACT, that was a preference of because right now what we have is over 80% of our students already take ACT. We've had an ACT pilot, probably not a huge surprise. But we also asked them to place or to suggest other potential options. One of the other options that surfaced was Compass. Compass is currently used by the community colleges. Compass is a product that's going away. It's actually a product that's no longer there, and the community colleges are going to replace it with Accuplacer. So we know that is actually hitting. We had NWE maps actually popped up as a preference of a potential assessment that listed in that as well. And then another one, ASVAB, actually was one recommendation. Now ASVAB's not the same type of test, and I don't believe it would meet the requirements of the state law relative to that. But it is interesting to know that there is an interest, at least for some, to actually consider that in our assessment vision and our future for that. We asked a question also around well, first of all, one question was, if we would go into this transition year, would you want both a pilot of a college entrance exam and a NISA test at high school? I will let you guess how that one was actually responded to. They wouldn't want both, right? So if we're going down this process, I think we would actually use the transition year and make sure that we get to learn a little bit more about our college entrance exams and how that's administered, but really to use that effectively. I think that was clearly the message. And we asked a question about the ability for students to select the type of assessment that they had. And perhaps within a narrower window is how one way you could look at that. If we select a test, should we also think about providing another option? And perhaps the other option might be something like Accuplacer or whatever community colleges are happening to use. We heard that back in the conversations and listening sessions at AQuest. I heard quite a bit of, well, why couldn't we use Accuplacer for some of our students who are just planning to enter into community college, that's where they're trying to go. If our real focus is around what the students' futures are, as far as where they're going to end up needing to focus their energy and attention, I think that's a really important thing for us to think about. It may take us this kind of bridge year to be able to study that a little bit more, but we thought, and I think it was true in the domain committee, certainly in the Assessment Tenant conversations, that finding a way that maybe we can present that as an option, at least in this transition year, so we can study that a little closer is desirable. We have a requirement for alternate assessments, right? For our severe and profound students that, in special ed, that they would have to be able to have that there. So we know that has to be part of our process as well, that actually has to be administered at all grade levels, by the way, because even at high school, we don't believe ACT or SAT or AccuPlacer necessarily meet that part of the requirement. But we also know that there's other special ed needs, and so we were looking at how we would study and make sure that whatever we come up with is giving every student an opportunity to advance their goals in their direction. And so we envision kind of putting that together as a proposal. I will tell you we'll have to go for an RFP for a high school college entrance exam. We'll explore a bit more about how we can do that, because I think we might be able to do it in such a way that we could at least next year present an option for AccuPlacer or one of the other more kind of traditional college entrance exams. We'll have to look at some of that, and we'll bring back that recommendation to you next year, next month. Melody was doing 2 years in 1 month. I'm doing 2 years in, anyway. So the reality is there's that work yet to do as well. And then ultimately, pulling those pieces together and saying, hey, look, the way that we accomplish this for the bridge year includes a contract with DRC with the details that Valerie can kind of walk you through. She kind of presents some, I would say, some recommendations and some options that I think probably in a little more detail, so you can understand the costs of those various options and what we would ultimately recommend. A lot of credit, by the way, to our team, and actually a lot of credit to DRC for working very hard on scaling back a contract that meets our needs for what we see as this bridge year, knowing that we're going into a longer term vision process with a longer term RFP for around our whole system. And so Valerie and team, thank you for your efforts to do that work, to really dive into the details of this, and I'll turn it over to Valerie for some of that overview. Hopefully I didn't steal all their thunder, but I probably did.
No, that was mine. Mine will just add to that, so that was perfect. I'm Valerie Foy. I'm Director of Statewide Assessment, and of course Jeremy Henniger, the Assistant Director, and I were very involved in this, and John Moon is the NISA Project Manager, and he handles our contracts. So we felt it would be best if we all came to present. I do also want to say that we've also been working with federal programs, special education, and ELL under the federal programs, because all of those teams are touched by this contract and give money to it. So we come to agreement on this. So the commissioner led in very well that we knew we wanted to do a bridge year this year. And so we went to DRC, and we said, we want you to give us, and we just listed all these different options, and we said, don't just bring us a contract. We want to know broken out costs for this, costs for all of these different pieces. And they got those to us, and then we began as a team breaking down and pulling in the pieces that we felt we had to have as essentials for a bridge year. And so I'm going to present what we just are recommending as to you, because of course you make the decision on this, as some essentials that we would see, some possible additions and some options is sort of how we've named it. And so, yeah, okay. And so we, I'm gonna go through this, and then we'll talk about those different pieces. So the pieces that are included on page 1 are project management, assessment system development, delivery, administration of assessments. You can take some time, because if we're only here, of course, to present this for your review. We're not trying to vote on this month. We're just here presenting something so you can consider the pieces. And if you continue on down through and flip to page 2, you'll find standard setting, reporting our pieces that we came together as a team to say, if we have to bridge this year, what's the smallest contract we could put together and serve our students to bridge the year, to assess them in a consistent way before perhaps we go to some other changes. and also support our forward movement on assessing our students and meeting the needs of college and career ready standards so that we perpetuate that forward movement. So if you look at the base cost there, it's $4,238,822. And if you remember correctly, our contract at the end of the year when we voted in was $7.3 million. And so we have significantly reduced the amount of this contract that we're suggesting as a base contract. Now, what this would get us, what these pieces right here for the 4.3 would get us, is testing for English language arts and math in grades 3 through 8, and science at grades 5 and 8. It would give us the alternate assessment for grades 3 through 8 and 11, because we do need that 11th grade piece there for our alternate assessment. And then there's some decisions to make about what type of writing we're going to include. So the type of writing that Matt referenced is called text-dependent analysis. And really our entire revised English language arts test, including the text-dependent analysis, reaches to these new standards. We have many, Corey was here talking about depth of knowledge. We have raised the rigor of this test. It meets our standards, and we have increased the depth of knowledge of our items. They talked about science, a lot of them being 1s and 2s. That was the way it was on the old reading test, and a lot more of them now go up into the higher DOKs. Text-dependent analysis is an actual writing piece that is an integration of reading and writing, where students read something and then they analyze it and explain it over here in the writing. We ran that this year at grades 5 through 8 and 11, and we are prepared to run it as an operational test next year. So all of those pieces would be included here. And then I have 3 scope additions that you will see next as recommendations. So Jeremy, do you just want to talk about the UEB Braille, please?
Yeah, on last year's contract, we had UEB Braille as an option. There is a transition nationwide going from an older type of Braille to this new type of Braille. And because of the transition, and each student is in individual places, we put a $50,000 option on that, and then we're only paying that if we have orders for that specific type of new Braille, the UEB Braille. So this last year we had up to $50,000 on it. We had 2 grades that had that ordered, and so we paid $28,000. So it's in there again for this next year, because we have to translate that in for those students that on this test this year, up to that amount based on the orders that we would have there. So that's up to that amount to cover all the translations.
And that'll go away when when all of our students have transitioned over to it. So we're providing 2 Braille forms right now when requested. Okay. Then the independent alignment, when a new test is constructed or a series of new tests, as we are doing for English language arts, when those test forms are put in place with the items that our educators have written, an independent alignment of those is done. So it brings in a panel of experts and says, we didn't write the standards and we didn't write the items, and these items do match and test these standards. It is generally considered a requirement of large-scale assessment. And then last of all, the text-dependent analysis scoring validation. Our current writing test is double scored. 2 scorers read it at DRC. The costs to that, as you know, are considerable because our hand scoring is close to $500,000 on that. And we believe that we can provide the assurance of consistent reading and evaluation of these text-dependent analysis by doing a scoring validation of them. So it's not the same as scoring, the costs are not the same as scoring twice, but it provides a validation to assure our educators in Nebraska that these are being scored validly and reliably at DRC. And because of the changes in scoring from going from 2 readers to 1, I believe this would go far in helping assure our educators of that process, that they can depend on it. Now, I know those do raise the contract if those scope additions are chosen, and it would be 5.2 then, but still considerably less than the 7.3 that it was at. Then underneath the blue, we have what we're calling our scope options. So these are all decisions that really you, the board, will make. Grade 11 NISA RMS. Is that your preference for where we would go next year? If it is, that's the cost of it, $226,020. Oh, I'm sorry, Reading, Math, Science. Us and our little abbreviations. NISA Reading, Math, Science. We have on here a field test for text-dependent analysis at 5 through 8 and 11. If you're not doing 11th grade, that goes out of there. I can tell you, I don't think we are going to need this. We field tested 5 different TDAs at 5 through 8 and 11 this year. And we believe we're going to have enough viable ones from that we won't need to field test again this year. But they're being range found in 7 rooms by Nebraska educator teams as we speak. And we will get the psychometric statistics from those shortly, before you will need to make before you make a decision. There is a decision to be made around the writing assessment. I had DRC price these 3 out separately so that you could see what NISA writing costs at 4th grade, and that's the complete cost to deliver it, to score it, it's everything together, what it is at 8th grade and what it is at 11th grade. And you have expressed concerns over 8th and 11th grade, and very rightfully so, when we consider the last 4 years. And if I can read what you've been saying, I think you're not very interested in going there. And we have the text-dependent analysis at those upper grades, which is a writing task. So we really have changed that. The other thing I want to say about the NISA writing test is it was matched to the 6 traits of writing. It was not matched to the standards. It actually was never, ever matched to the Nebraska state standards. The domains of it were the 6 traits of writing. I won't say there wasn't crossover, but it was not matched to the standards. The new text-dependent analysis is matched to our state standards. So there is, I think, a decision you will want to consider about grade 4 writing. And this is the survey, Matt, that the commissioner talked about releasing. What would the elementary principals and our elementary teachers say about the 4th grade writing test? Would they like to see that stay another year? Would they be interested in field testing, text-dependent analysis? Where do they want to go? They know they've been instructing the new standards and working toward the newer standards, so they have a good idea of whether we want to go with the NISA writing, whether they want to go with the NISA writing or the text-dependent analysis. Or if we didn't go with either, we may be still within the confines of the law, because it said we had to test 3 grades and report 1. 1 of 3 grades. Okay, thank you. And we will definitely be doing that, because we will be testing writing at grades 5 through 8 and 11. And I do want to add one more point, and I'm really getting down into test design and the pieces like this, but even all of our tests that we have up designed ready for, so 3 through 8 and 11, whatever you decide, we have also embedded independent writing items that also assess writing. And they are not the old type, like here's a sentence, put the comma in it. Here's this, does it get a question mark or a period? They're very high rigor, based around our writing and our reading standards, and they're very integrated. They have little reading passages, and then they ask students to do things like select 2 paraphrases from below with information that are represented in both passages above. So very high level skills. Those are on 3 through 8 and 11. If you go that way, that particular one is not on grade 3. I just want to say that. Okay, the types are, my example was not a grade 3 example, I want to be clear. So those are choices. We hope to have more input by sending out a brief survey. And then finally, we have the grades 3 and 4 field test, and that's one of the questions. We are not ready to put an operational grade 3 and 4 in this year. We just ran a pilot this year. If we want to move forward with that, and it would be your choice, and we want input from our educators, we would need to field test that. And we may choose not to do that in a bridge year like this. So those are the options that we bring before you, having looked through all, we just had the pricing on a lot of pieces. And we just tried to come in pared down to do a bridge over the year of 2016-17 to give you the choices.
Well, I think going to questions is fine. You can see there are a lot of details of this, and we wanted to present this to you so you have plenty of time to reflect on it, but kind of hitting those main points, our main decision points are pretty well spelled out here. I would say of all those different options at the end, depending on what you want to do around writing, most of those we're not recommending that you would do, but writing is one of those decision points that we do need to make. I think I would generally say the rest are things that we would not necessarily recommend that you do. Mm-hmm. The high school portion of this might be something we would want to leave in as an option until we knew for certain that we could get another assessment put in place and meet our requirements. But that would be an option that we would be able to exercise versus an option that we have to do, right? So things along those lines are the nature of what we'll bring you in June.
Okay, Glenn, I think you first, and then we'll.
I just wondered about Check for Learning. Is that in here, and what is the future of Check for Learning?
Do you want to speak to Check for
Sure.
Learning?
Yeah, Check for Learning is included in here. We did a lot of work this last year with teachers to write new questions for English language arts, the new technology enhanced items, including the TDA, the text dependent analysis questions. We think that it's very important that we were able to put those into a system that those teachers can then access in this next school year, along with all the items that they have previously written for math and science. All of the material, all of the content that is in Check for Learning is our content. So as we put that in there, we retain that ability to pull it out and to use it and to do whatever we want, all created by Nebraska educators through the time that we've had Check for Learning. And so during this bridge year, districts that are using that system, which is about 200 districts out of the 245 districts, they'd continue to have access to do that. We provide that tool to them, and then they are able to determine what ways make sense to use that tool in their own curriculum, own assessment systems, and as devised by local control and everything. And then we support through that. We know that we would like them to use it in better ways. I think instead of some of them are using it just for test prep and those types of things, but it really is a system that can be used to inform instruction, and we want to continue to encourage that, and then set us up for a place that as we go into the new vision and working on the new vision, that we have that there and able to see, is this something we need to carry on in that new vision as we get feedback from schools and districts and those types of things. And if we need to go in a different direction, then we can do that. But we think it's important that it's in there and supported for this next year to do the things that they need to, especially the text-dependent analysis. There's going to be good examples of this text-dependent analysis in that system. It will capture the student's written response, and then districts will be able to use that to score and inform their instructions. We're already working with ESUs to do regional types of scoring with TDA, and they would be using that system to support those processes.
So then in a way, we have not lost our investment in the new items for math and English language arts. So
Yeah,
they'll live on
and that's important across the board when you look at the contract. A lot of the material, well, actually all the items that we have written are ours. So no matter what we do in the future, we take those with us if it's with another company. Now, depending on where we go, we don't know where that's going to be, if we'll use those and how we'll use them. No matter what, we're going to get some use out of them, because if nothing else, we'll give them back to districts to have them do formative assessments and those types of things. So in many ways, the cost that you see here are things that we get to keep even beyond the contract, and I think that's important to realize.
Molly?
This is exciting information for me, being on accountability all those years. But since I'm not on the assessment team right now, I just had some clarifying questions. First of all, I know before we've had accommodations for 11th graders, not just the alternate assessment for the 1%. Does the ACT allow accommodations for a certain percentage of our students with special needs?
Whatever the college entrance exam is, the ACT, SAT, wherever we might go, because we have to release an RFP, we've done phone calls over that exact point, over the accommodations with both those particular companies, and would also definitely have it with others. And around accommodations and whether they would be willing to work with our state on those. Now, we have to work through the process, but we're cognizant of it. And so there are some accommodations that are allowed, some that are allowed, and the test is not college reportable. The test results are not college reportable. And then there are some that I gather are not allowed. So it's definitely a part of our conversation, and it's definitely something we're aware of, that we want to include the language around and the RFP, that we want cooperation.
All right, well I just have 3 questions. Here's my second one is,
Molly, can
go ahead.
I also want to point out, Sharon Heater, our colleague that works in special education, has been very on top of this and has been working with the districts that we did the pilot with to try to get feedback from them. So as we go into the RFP process, we can make sure there's really great language in there to get what we need for all of our students and their needs. So we're already working with special education to try to make sure that that's happening as we go through that. So I just wanted to put that in.
Thank you. That was one huge concern. The second one is just my mind trying to wrap around validity and reliability. You mentioned we might have an option in the transitional year to have a national test, such as, let's say, ACT, SAT, either one. You'll have to choose one, though. But then you also talked about the AccuPlacer as an option. And my mind immediately thought, well, we still have to have reports on status scores as part of our AQuest classification. And my simple mind was like, seems to me you'd have to have a uniform test for all students to take if you're going to definitely be comparing raw scores. So I just was a little confused. If we have AccuPlacer and you get scoring, how are you going to compare that with the people that do the ACT? So maybe I missed something, but it sounded like you hadn't decided yet.
Can I respond to that a little bit from some of the discussions at the assessment level, assessment committee level? I think it's important that we think about, sometimes we decide where we are because of federal expectations. We have to keep in mind those federal expectations are changing. And so what we've not really started to look at yet, but we can, is how are we going to look at what decisions we make as it relates to reporting. If you recall from the presentations we received in DC, the feds with us are giving the expectations that there's opportunities for multiple assessments and for differing assessments. And one of the examples that were given in one of the sessions we attended was that they may allow states to have a menu of options and then work through the process of how do you determine cut scores, how do you determine your state processes. So I think we have a lot during this bridge year to learn about where we should be going in 2017 and beyond.
My question, and I did not hear the same thing you heard, because I still thought we were mandated to test reading 3 through 8 and 11, and then math 3 through 8 and 11, And then in regard to the writing component, we choose to do that for 8 and 11. But again, for validity and reliability, I could see that, not that I'm a psychometrician, but I can see that that could create some issues. I did hear in the meeting that we went to, since I was very interested in ESSA as well, that we are not saying your status scores and your statewide test is who you are, and that is not one, that's just one method of evaluation, because it should be formative assessments, other national assessments, ASVAB, or if you're community college. But if we're going to pay for one test, I've had people say, well, if I'm not college bound, is ACT really the test for me? Let's say, for example. But the community colleges do accept ACT and I don't know about SAT, but as a qualifying test instead of the AccuPlacer. So it really still would serve the needs of the 2-year student. But I'm going to leave it to your assessment. That just jumped at me, that I think it would cost a lot of money to create a valid comparison between two different state tests running same time. But again, that was just big for me. The third thing is I'm a little confused because our people in schools and their parents are saying nationwide too much testing, and a lot of schools are incorporating English language arts in one. And right now we do reading 3 through 8 and 11, but writing only 4, 8, and 11. So I'm just a little bit confused about the second page for the text-dependent analysis. Is that a component of what we call reading NISA right now?
Right.
Okay.
Well, the test, it wasn't on the old reading, but on the NISA English language arts
ELAs.
or NISA reading and writing. The text-dependent analysis is embedded in what was the old reading test.
And so this was my segue to that question.
Okay.
Again, a complex subject for a momentary question time. But if TDAs really do evaluate writing skills, do we have to have another writing component for?
No.
No, so it gets rid of that extra testing window for writing.
If we didn't do 4, 8, and 11, we would eliminate that extra 3-week window,
of
the
testing.
last 2 weeks in January and the first week in
3
February.
and 4 is writing because they're little kiddos, but 5, 6, 7, 8 are all on the computer, right? Could be if we wish.
Okay.
TDA?
Majority.
Yeah, the majority are, yes.
All right, and then back to 11th ACT. Is there a TDA component for the writing test for 11? Or do we have to do another test for 11th in addition to the ACT?
Well, there's an English language arts part of it, but to actually do a performance writing is the plus writing. It's an additional component.
But it's from ACT and it is writing. So.
Both SAT and ACT have a plus writing section.
I can't wait to see their request for proposals, and I love this transition, your possibility. And Rachel, I'm not against having 2 different statewide tests, but that gives me friction.
And I think tomorrow we'll have that opportunity to have discussion as we learn more also through ESSA and think about some of the things that have opened up, such as using adaptive assessments or an option. So we have lots of assessment discussion for the next year as we move into 2017. Any other questions? If not, just real quick in summary, if I captured this correctly, in June we'll come back and basically make 3 decisions. The first decision will be moving forward with some sort of RFP around the 11th grade for a college entrance exam or exams. The second will be how we want to move forward with writing, or not, I guess, in some respects. Writing / text-dependent analysis for 4, 8, 11, and then come back and we'll be taking action around the NISA DRC contract. So those are really our 3 primary action items that we'll be looking at in June. Is that correct? Okay. And I want to thank your team, John, Jeremy, Valerie, for all that you've done, and Commissioner, your listening sessions and the surveys that you've added into this to get input from all of our schools as we've moved forward.
This TDA stuff is cool.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on to student success and access reports. Molly?
Yes, I'll make mine quick. First of all, I did want to look at John Whistle and say thank you so much for spearheading the transition team. I mean, that's a huge conversation across the state about our students being prepared for college, career, civic life. And Pat Tim, educational opportunities and access. We know that early childhood is always Jen, she's your advocate all the time. It's a foundation for student success. And I'm specifically, is Jolene coming in? Maybe I didn't know if she's such a brainiac. It's nice to have her in the room here. But in my presentation, I wanted to update you on the safety standards document. You probably recollect last meeting we talked about how safety it starts out for security, and it's by nature. It's like the fires, the tornadoes. But safety and security deals with human component of safety. And I just wanted to compliment all of our partners that went together. Did they all have a copy of this? The standards and indicators? If they don't, could they have one by tomorrow? We will be bringing this back to you next month for approval. What we have really talked about, and Pat just left, but he made a good point, is the document itself we need to approve in June, and there have been some additions based on our conversations that also include digital citizenship as it relates to our students' use of their software, of their technology, and also digital citizenship, how we can incorporate the use of technology without children becoming wildly distracted. And part of the security, they even talked about today, is components of behavioral health. So I just wanted to highlight, this is something that you're going to be asked to consider after you get this document. Right now, we have citations in statute, title, and rule. And Commissioner, I don't know if you've been caught up to speed with our domain meeting, but Dawn Lynn Rice, and she's gone now too, she said that she found 4, and actually Jolene Palmer said there are 8 different standards that are not in rule and citations. And so they're going to go back to their core committees, but they'll come back to us because there are some things that need to be actually updated in policy, very minimal. And if you hear anything I say, this is probably the most important thing. Their team that did these standards and indicators every time said, is this going to cost our school districts extra money? And the answer is no. These are things in place, but our team, our 4 state board members, really were emphatic about how security is an issue nationwide. If you've traveled to airports lately or you just pick up the news, we have to make sure that our schools are not just safe but secure. And our students in their personalized learning plans know about personal security, and that's where it involves, evidently, we have some schools that are not, I wish you had this sheet, but one of them is like the school system should have policies and protocols regarding security and visitor management in alignment with readiness and emergency management for schools. We have no policy about that. And today a school called and said, we have an intruder, and they didn't even have a protocol in place they'd practice. So I hope you're open-minded when we come back with the 8 standards that might need some policy, and some of those can just be embedded in Rule 10. They're already done in many school districts. The only other component I was going to bring up is we had Sue and Matthew in our meeting talking about EBAs. And it was brought up that everybody should at least be a good school when it talks about security. But we talked about creating rubrics exactly from the safety standard rubric, and then they could be up to a different level, like needs improvement, good, great, or excellent, based on the security they chose to do. And that comes back to Pat's comment. We don't want to overburden everybody by you have to do everything. But if you have the rubric, Matt and Sue said that they could create the rubric so that you could be classified based on how well your local district chooses to conform to the standards. And that way they really will own this. I thought Pat said, well, every school board should know this stuff. So if this becomes part of AQUIS and integrated, it'll motivate through EBA. And then if it's okay with you, Commissioner, when it comes to our board next month, we will be voting on approval of the safety standards document, standards and indicators, with permission. And Donlin's back. There'll be language that they present to the board next month that includes levity for them to create policy indicators on those 8 points that have not, I mean, they're the most up-to-date, very essential pieces of security and safety for our schools. Donlin, you were kind of out when I was saying that stuff, but did my other board members want to add anything?
Can I add something real quick? Molly mentioned there was an incident in a school in regards to an intruder coming in and lack of action, if you will, by some of the officials in regards to not knowing what to do. What's interesting is they had a plan in place. It was completed by a contractor. It was on the shelf, but nobody had looked at it. Nobody knew where it was, and nobody was briefed on it. But they did have a plan on the shelf. So I go along with what Molly's saying. This will highlight the need for emphasis by all parties.
Thank you. Any questions for Molly? Any other?
Thank you so much.
Is there a report for data and continuous improvement this month? Any? Okay. The strategic planning report, we'll give a little more of an update tomorrow. I mean, we had the full morning, and there's just some timelines there, meeting, as they mentioned, with some of the staff today, and so we'll give you a little bit of an update for where we're looking over the next couple of months. And the strategic planning committee will be meeting in May and potentially in June as we work through that process. Commissioner, anything else on strategic planning you want to add? All right, then we'll move to policy. Pat.
Well, to help out not having a long meeting these 2 days, we had our policy committee meeting was held with a phone conference on Friday, April 22nd. And everyone was present. And we did a 4-year review of policy B10, which has to do with special meetings, emergency meetings, and all meetings held by video conferencing. There were no substantive changes there, so there will be no action required. We also, and we talked about this last time, policy B5 with board committees. We do have some board committees in place. We have the opportunity to add ad hoc committees depending upon what we're doing, or special interest committees like we've had with early childhood and comprehensive education. Also, because of the change of the way we're doing business, we've talked about an AQuest teaching and learning committee and the student success and access. And so that was talked about a month ago, and that will be on the board agenda. Oh, and the third one was a suggestion of a board and finance committee, or budget and finance committee. And so those suggestions will be on for tomorrow. We also discussed the B12, the public policy or public participation in board meetings policy. And we reviewed those revisions. We had some questions last time about clarification of the way things read. We reviewed those, made some further revisions. That is in your e-meetings, and you can look at that, and this will be on the board agenda for tomorrow as well. I think we did hopefully get things clarified. The one thing I do want to bring up, we do know that we want things done in a timely fashion so that staff has the opportunity to get prepared, and we also have to follow our open meetings laws so that we're notified in time. And that brings me to the fact that you may, as a board member, have someone come to you and say, I would like to make some comments at your board meeting. Now, you need to direct those to the commissioner so that can be taken care of. But as a board member, you are responsible for knowing what our policy is so that in a timely fashion, you get that information there instead of calling at the last minute and saying, oh, by the way, one of my constituents called and would like to make a presentation. So just remember that you have some responsibility there as well. The last one that we have discussed in quite detail is policy B7, reimbursement for expenses, and that is attached. That will not be voted on until June. We want to, because there were lots of changes made, we want to give you time to look at all of that. And I'm going to ask Patrick and then Rachel if she has additions. The two of them really spent a lot of time and did some research on the way things were done now, how other entities handle their expenses, and what we're required to do by statute. So Patrick, would you like to?
Well, gosh, this is a subject I don't have much interest in.
That's why I'm calling on you. I'm putting you on the spot.
I think we have done a pretty fair job of looking at what other public bodies are doing, what the legislature does, what the regents does, what some other bodies have done. I think we had some initial questions about what's do we want to have a list of organizations that we want to allow attendance to and so forth, and I think we kind of clarified that pretty well. I'd encourage folks to look this over, but I felt for a long time that we needed some kind of a structure as far as expenses and travel, and I think this probably is, it's not everything that I wanted, I want to assure you. I would have probably been a lot tougher, but I think it recognizes a lot of things. It gives us some flexibility. It recognizes the fact that I think that, obviously not everybody lives within 50 miles of Lincoln. And, because of that, we're going to have some additional travel expenses if it's, whether it's Molly in North Platte or we have a future board member in Scotts Bluff or Harrison, Nebraska. Hopefully it accommodates them and understands that they have some additional needs. From that standpoint, I think we've done a fairly adequate job of trying to address a travel policy that, provide some parameters, I think, and that's been my concern all along. I don't think these are overly stringent by any means. I've served on a lot of boards and commissions in my life, and I think most of those had travel policies that were probably more conservative than this. So. And I appreciate the fact that Rachel and I sat down and she came, she had a lot of good input, and I think we've reached a point where this is pretty acceptable. So I'd encourage you to read it and look it over, and let's have a vote on it so I can quit making my commentary every month. Thank you.
Rachel, do you have anything?
No, I would just concur with Pat, and I think Pat really did a lot of research, and he really took the initiative to pull the pieces together. I think we did a little final editing together is how I'd view it, but I really think that it does move us in a direction that still allows the board certainly to make decisions that we make, but it gives a little more structure, and I think that's good for continuity of boards going forward. And that, I think, is a piece that became clear that that's an important consideration for us, that we may not be here in these seats for years and years and years, and so it's important to give that structure to future boards as well and guidance. So thanks, Pat.
And I'm sorry, John, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to thank the commissioner and the staff, because they helped a great deal in doing a lot of research on this. Thank you.
John, did you have?
Yeah, I wanted to thank you, as a matter of fact, Pat, for your diligent work in regards to making this document possible. If you were taking into consideration all the other travel expense, if you will, regulations, policies, whether it be the Regency, legislature, whatever the case may be, you all took all that into consideration. And just from my personal point of view, I look at this document as very, very fair. Thank you all. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, we encourage you all to look at it over the next 30 days, and we will vote on it in June. And as you can hear from the committee, there's a consensus with us, so that we hope we can move forward in June.
All right, thanks, Pat. We'll move to legislation. Lily. Do you have a report?
We did not have a meeting, but I'll just tell you that of the 12 bills that we offered opinions on, 4 of them were approved by the governor. LB 694, LB 930, which you know best of all, which is what we've been talking about, a statewide assessment, LB 1066 and LB 1086. So those should be online and you can read the details on those. And Brian, do you have anything else? And in particular about there are going to be some studies done, interim studies, which there are a number of those and are financial related, as you might guess, in many instances.
Briefly, Brian Halstead, Deputy Commissioner. As you can see, the document that Lily referred to is the document that contains all of the bills that the board formally took positions on this last session. And the results of that, as you're all well aware, the 104th Legislature second session adjourned sine die on April 20th, and the legislature, the 105th Legislature first session, will not convene again until January 4th of 2017. So there's a little bit of time that we have. There's also attached interim studies. We went through all of the interim studies that were introduced. Committees in the legislature prioritize those as to what they think is their most important and their least. Staff at the department have been assigned to reach out to the sponsoring senator and to the committee chair to let them know if there's information they need on that. Please feel free to contact them. This is sort of the time of the year when the legislature isn't really doing lots of work, so this will probably pick up more when August comes around and everything else. And as you can see, this last legislative session, there were not a whole number of large education policy decisions out there. There were bills that dealt with taxation and finance and all of that that you didn't weigh in on. So I'd say you again had a rather successful year in helping craft good policy for the state in education. And obviously you've spent a great deal of time talking about LB 930 and all the changes there. As the document indicates, all bills will become effective on July 21st of this year, 3 calendar months after adjournment. So we're already working on assessment, even though it hasn't yet become officially law. But by the time you come back around in August, it all will be. So I'll answer any questions you have, but stop there.
Patrick?
On the legislative resolutions and the upcoming hearings on those, can you make sure that we, all the members of this board, get as soon as there's a schedule on those hearings that we know? It'd also be helpful to know whether there's going to be testimony from the department. I'd appreciate knowing that, so if you can provide that, that'd be most appreciated.
Can I just add something to that? Because I think Patrick raised a good point. Number one, that you know those things. I will let you know if we're getting asked to come over there and testify, because that's an interesting dynamic for us. And I think one of the things, we get asked to provide information often in those settings. And I think we're going to have to rethink a little bit about how we do that. I mean, I don't want to put staff in a bad position. It feels like that environment's turned into a cross-examination environment a little bit more. And so I think we're going to prepare differently for those things. It's a different setting now, and I think we'll be thoughtful about that as we go forward. So I appreciate that point.
As you know, I had some concerns about that last year, and that's the reason I feel the way I do about it. So again, I think you're looking at how you provide that information, and providing us with the information as to when those hearings are going to be will be very helpful. So thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Molly?
I wanted to crosswalk both of the documents we have. LB 1026, this is on the sheet of things postponed. It's changed provisions relating to educational technology, updates to modernize the purpose and scope of Educational Technology Center at NDE. I see as we move forward with AQUES, there is definitely going to be some funding foundation that needs to be supported. And I wondered if that had anything to do with the interim study that is regarding technology. It's, which one is it?
558,
Yeah.
Technology Communications Commission.
Nebraska Ed Technologies. Is there any interim study that is talking about funding for the important infrastructure of blend ed, professional development, and data and continuous improvement? If you look at Glen, I mean, if what we're doing is so important, but if it's not funded, I think AQuest will not be fully fleshed out.
Well, keep in mind, the other thing that staff is already working on is writing our next biennium budget request that in August you'll get to see the first draft of that. You'll have to approve in September. So some of those items you may find embedded in the budget, you ultimately will decide whether it's submitted to the legislature. So some of that is yet to be decided. That's the other legislative activity going on at the department. We started back in January starting to work on what is our future on the next biennium budget, because you have to approve it in September. The governor has to introduce it in the next legislature for them to consider what the funding is for the next biennium budget. So some of this works together. None of the interim studies that are listed there are connected to the bill you talked about. The bill there was actually an attempt to put into statute budget issues you put in your last biennium budget request for upgrades in the data systems that some senators had. Well, why do you need all this money? So then we went back around to, well, here's a set of statutes that if you upgraded them to the 21st century would in fact define why you would fund all of this over here. So it's an ongoing activity of ours to try to better shape the vision and what the true needs are.
I do have a question for you. For example, in the interim study list is Senator Sullivan's 587, and in view of the fact that she will not be there, did somebody else pick up that?
Well,
interim
Senator
study?
Sullivan is there until January 4th.
That's true. So
That
this will
interim study
continue.
is the infamous one that almost every committee introduces that says we can study anything that's within our jurisdiction. So we'll be seeing as to if there's any items the Education Committee is looking at or wants information on. So that
I mean, that's a prime opportunity to look at what your issues
Right.
are about
Sure.
technology. It fits in there beautifully.
Yeah, and might go with that career tech one too. They're providing, that's 533, promoting career education and training that can lead to job readiness, 533, and middle
Yeah. Right.
skilled jobs. I just think if they invite you to be part of any of those interim studies, always promote the infrastructure at AQuest, because the support of that does have to be funded.
Well, and some
politically.
pieces of that, if you see it went to Business and Labor Committee, not to Education, but pieces of that were part also of your study committee on career education and some of the things that schools, districts, businesses are already working on, and the need for making sure that graduates from our K-12 system have the basic knowledge and skills to move into those types of fields where we hear from business we can't find good workers. So that's why, if you'll notice, that's why Corey is assigned to that. He's already reached out to the sponsoring senator and the committee on that one as to if you let us know what you need. So again, not all of these, as you can see, are assigned to the Education Committee. So there are other committees that have impacts, just like I think you saw in your strategic planning this morning. There are other things besides K-12 schools that we interact with, and the ability to bring that together as a system as part of that. So.
And yet clearly there's a proactive attempt here that there is a department staff person assigned to
Right.
each of these
Oh,
interim
good.
studies.
Right.
Oh,
So
One thing, my final comment about the technology infusion that we requested and did not receive is, I think it's really important to say that we can actually reduce expenditures if we don't do our information in silos. And if we can do some crosswalks with other departments, HHS, Justice, Labor, some of those same data streams are going to better validate all our departments.
And the commissioner talks about services in lieu of aid going out to school districts to do it all on their own. I think that's a concept that we're going to continue to be trying to promote, as to if you spend a little money here, you can save a lot more out there, because 245 school districts trying to do this all independently is not the most effective system. So,
any other questions of Brian or Lily? Thank you, Lily. Okay, before we move to adjournment, just quickly tomorrow, I know we've had a long day today, and we have a long day tomorrow. We will be looking at maybe changing the order a little bit of the items on the agenda to basically do the special presentation last. So tomorrow we'll have the special presentation by Reg Lichty and Amy Starzynski, who will really be focusing on, and I'm sure you all have read your pre-reading. We had lots of pre-reading for this meeting also.
Hours.
On ESSA. And this is our opportunity to really start to engage as a board in the discussion around understanding ESSA and understanding what our role will be as we move forward in making decisions. You know, be careful. I think one of the things, major theme, be careful what you ask for. And it is moving some responsibility back to the state, so we need to really be thinking about what our responsibility will be as state board members with ESSA. I'm guessing that we'll be finished, overall by about 12:30 or 1 tomorrow. But again, it may depend on how many questions. Could be a little earlier, could be a lot later, depending upon what kinds of questions that you have from the pre-reading and the presentation that'll be done. For planning, for June, I don't know at this point if we'll have any committee meetings on Wednesday. We may just be on Thursday and Friday for meetings for next month in June, but for August, you might want to be kind of putting your Wednesday on hold. I'm guessing we'll probably have some of our committees meeting on Wednesday, since we'll be really spending some time with strategic planning, with the budget, with lots of things that are coming up for August, priority schools as well. So, Pat?
Are we going to have a strategic planning committee meeting tomorrow as well?
I don't know if we will. We're going to announce tomorrow. I'm going to guess we will in May, but probably not tomorrow. We may just touch base tomorrow on the plan for when we meet, but I'm going to guess it might be after their next meeting of stakeholders, whichever group that is that they're meeting with. Key influencers, thank you. And that's like mid-May?
May 18th.
Okay, so I'm guessing that it might be right after that. All right, then let me find it here. We're moving to adjournment. The regularly scheduled meeting of the State Board of Education will reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow in this room. Thanks, everybody. It was a great day.